Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. My name is Eli Markham, and I've spent 15 years behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. The cab of my Peterbilt 389 has been more of a home to me than any apartment I've rented. I've seen every kind of weather, driven every type of terrain, and learned to handle whatever the road throws at me. At least that's what I believed until October 15, 2023. The incident happened on Route 200 in Montana, a stretch of highway the locals call the Lonely Road. It's not hard to understand why. The route winds through dense forest and mountain passes, with towns sometimes spaced 100 miles apart. Cell service is spotty at best, and the few gas stations you'll find are the kind that still use mechanical pumps and close at sunset. I was hauling a load of industrial equipment from Seattle to Minneapolis, running behind schedule due to unexpected maintenance in Missoula. The sun had already begun its descent behind the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and purple. My dispatcher, Ron, had warned me about a storm system moving in from the northwest. "Better find somewhere to hunker down for the night, Eli," he'd said during our last radio check. But I was stubborn, convinced I could make it to the next town before the weather hit. The first drops of rain started hitting my windshield around 7:15 p.m. I remember checking my watch because the digital display on my dashboard had been flickering, something that had never happened before. The radio, which had been keeping me company with a local country station, deteriorated into static. Not unusual for these parts, but it left me alone with the rhythmic swish of my wipers and the growing darkness. That's when I saw it. Hazard lights blinking weakly through the rain, about a quarter-mile ahead. An old Ford Crown Victoria, the kind favored by retired police officers, pulled off on the shoulder. In my years on the road, I've helped dozens of stranded motorists. It's an unwritten code among truckers. You stop when you can because someday you might be the one needing help. I slowed my rig, checking my mirrors out of habit. No other vehicles in sight, just an endless ribbon of wet asphalt disappearing into the gloom behind me. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the roof of my cab like thousands of impatient fingers. Something felt off about the scene as I pulled up behind the Crown Vic. The driver's door was slightly ajar, but the hood was up, blocking any view of the front seat. Standard procedure when I stop to help is to call in my location to dispatch first, but my CB radio produced nothing but static, and my cell phone showed no service typical for this stretch. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, watching the rain create halos around my headlights. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were no footprints in the mud around the car. If someone had gotten out to check the engine, there should have been tracks, but the shoulder was pristine except for the tire marks where the Crown Vic had pulled off. Professional instinct warred with 15 years of experience. The Good Samaritan in me said someone might be in trouble. The veteran trucker said something wasn't right. I decided to split the difference. I'd check it out, but I'd leave my engine running and keep my keys in my pocket. I also grabbed the heavy mag light I keep next to my seat, as much for its weight as its ability to pierce the darkness. The rain plastered my jacket to my shoulders as I approached the Crown Vic. Water streamed off the raised hood, and the hazard lights cast alternating red flashes across the wet pavement. That's when I saw the first detail that turned my concern into dread. Bullet holes, at least 3 of them, clustered in the driver's side window. The glass hadn't shattered completely, but it was webbed with cracks, and darker stains that the rain couldn't quite wash away matted the interior fabric. My heart began to pound, and that sixth sense that long-haul truckers develop was screaming at me to get back in my rig. I took one step backward, then another, trying to keep my movements calm and deliberate despite the adrenaline surging through my system. That's when I heard it, a sound almost lost in the rainfall, a twig snapping in the forest beside the road. The figure that emerged from the tree line moved with an unnatural fluidity that immediately set off alarm bells in my mind. Average height, maybe 5'10", but rail-thin, wearing what looked like layers of weather-beaten clothing. In the alternating flash of the hazard lights, I could see that his face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with deep-set eyes that reflected the red glow like a nocturnal animal's. He didn't walk so much as glide across the shoulder, his movements too smooth for the uneven ground. Everything about him was wrong. The angle of his head, the way his arms hung at his sides, the complete lack of reaction to the pouring rain. But what disturbed me most was his unwavering focus. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking through me, as if I were merely an obstacle between him and something else. Training and experience kicked in. Rule number 1 of highway safety: when threatened, your truck is your best defense. I began backing toward my rig, keeping my eyes on the approaching figure while fumbling with my keys. The distance between us couldn't have been more than 30 feet, but it felt like miles. The stranger's pace quickened with each step I took backward, but he maintained that same fluid motion, like someone had pressed fast forward on a video. His head remained perfectly still while his legs ate up the distance between us. I could see his face more clearly now, skin pulled too tight across sharp cheekbones, lips drawn back in what might have been a smile but looked more like a grimace. I reached my truck and yanked open the door, practically throwing myself into the cab. My trembling hands fought with the lock as the figure closed the distance. The sound of the deadbolt clicking into place was immediately followed by a thud against the driver's side door that shook the entire cab. What happened next defied everything I know about physics and human capability. The man, if that's what he was, began pounding on the door with enough force to dent the metal. Each impact reverberated through the cab like a sledgehammer strike. I could see his face pressed against my window, those reflective eyes now inches from mine, that rictus grin stretching impossibly wide. I slammed the truck into gear and floored the accelerator. 600 horses roared to life, and my tires sprayed gravel as they fought for traction on the wet shoulder. The figure disappeared from my window, but in my mirrors, I could see him running behind the truck with that same unnatural speed, closing the gap despite my increasing velocity. The next curve in the road took me out of sight of the Crown Vic, and when I checked my mirrors again, the figure was gone. Relief flooded through me for a brief moment, until I heard something moving in the sleeper berth behind me. A sharp intake of breath that wasn't mine, the rustle of fabric, the creak of weight shifting on my bunk. The next few minutes remain a blur in my memory. I remember seeing signs for the town of Wolf Point ahead, my speedometer pushing 90 despite the rain and darkness. The local police station appeared like a beacon of hope, its lights cutting through the gloom. I barely remember pulling into the lot or running inside, my words tumbling out in a barely coherent stream as I tried to explain what had happened to the desk sergeant. 2 officers, Ramirez and Keller, according to their nameplates, took my statement. They listened patiently as I described the Crown Vic, the bullet holes, the strange man, and the sounds from my sleeper berth. I could see the skepticism in their eyes, the kind reserved for truckers who've been on the road too long or had too many energy drinks. But something changed when I mentioned the location. Ramirez and Keller exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. They asked me to wait while they checked my truck. 20 minutes later, they returned with grim expressions. "Mr. Markham," Officer Ramirez began, "we found evidence of forced entry on your driver's side door dents and scrapes consistent with your story. But there was no one in the sleeper berth." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "However, we did find this." She placed an evidence bag on the desk. Inside was a torn piece of fabric soaked with rain and something darker. It matched the layers of clothing I'd seen on the figure. "There's something else you should know," Officer Keller added. "That stretch of Route 200 has a history. Local folks call it Thomas's Road, after Thomas Hewitt, a former resident who disappeared 10 years ago after a series of violent incidents. His body was never found, but his Crown Victoria was discovered abandoned near where you stopped tonight." They told me more about Hewitt, how he'd been a recluse living in a cabin off the highway, how he'd developed increasingly erratic behavior after losing his job at the local lumber mill, how he'd begun fixating on passing motorists before his disappearance. The official theory was that he died in the woods, but his body was never recovered despite extensive searches. The officers arranged for me to stay at a local motel that night. They advised me to take a different route when I resumed my journey, though we all knew that wasn't really an option in my line of work. Before I left, Officer Ramirez gave me her card and made me promise to call if I remembered anything else. That was 6 months ago. I still drive the same routes, still haul the same loads, but something changed that night. I installed additional locks on my cab doors and a security camera system that monitors both inside and outside my truck. I don't stop for broken down vehicles after dark anymore. I call in their location to highway patrol instead. Sometimes, on long hauls through remote areas, I'll catch movement in my mirrors that doesn't quite match the motion of my truck, or I'll hear something that might be more than just the wind against my cab. In those moments, I remember Officer Keller's parting words. "Mr. Markham, in all the years since Hewitt disappeared, you're the first person who stopped at that Crown Vic and lived to tell about it. The truth is, everyone thinks they understand the dangers of life on the road, the weather, the fatigue, the mechanical failures. But there are other dangers out there, things that lurk in the spaces between cities, in the darkness beyond our headlights. I've seen one of them face to face, and I pray I never do again. These days, when I pass those quirky roadside attractions advertising local mysteries and legends, I don't smile anymore, because I know that sometimes the real horrors aren't the ones in tourist trap museums or on faded billboards. They're the ones waiting on lonely stretches of highway, wearing human shapes, but moving with inhuman grace, watching for lights to slow down and kind souls to stop and help. I still drive the long-haul routes. It's my life, my livelihood. But now I know that safety isn't a guarantee. It's a gift that can be snatched away in an instant by things that shouldn't exist but do. Whether they're flesh and blood or something else entirely, doesn't matter much when you're alone on a dark road, watching your mirrors, and praying that the movement you just saw was just a trick of the light. Because sometimes it isn't. The human mind is strange when you're alone on the road. Time becomes elastic, stretching and contracting like a rubber band. The date was October 15th, 2018, and that night changed everything I understood about reality. My name's Kellen Walsh, and I've spent 23 years driving routes most people wouldn't touch. Before that, I wore a badge for the Chicago PD, but that life seems like ancient history now. I was 48 then, old enough to know better, but still young enough to make stupid decisions. The kind of decisions that come back to haunt you when the sun goes down and you're alone with your thoughts. The first thing they teach you about long-haul driving is that routine keeps you alive. You check your mirrors every 30 seconds. You stop every few hours, whether you need to or not. You keep your logbook current. But routine can also kill you, lulling you into a false sense of security until something breaks through. That October night started like any other. I was hauling industrial equipment from Seattle to Minneapolis, taking Interstate 90 through Montana. The cab of my Peterbilt 579 was my second home-worn leather seat molded to my shape, dashboard cluttered with gas station coffee cups, and the constant hum of tires on asphalt serving as my white noise machine. The construction signs appeared around 7:39 p.m., orange diamonds reflecting my headlights like cat's eyes. Roadwork ahead, detour next exit. Standard stuff, nothing to worry about. The state highway they redirected us to wasn't on my usual route, but GPS showed it would eventually loop back to I-90. Just a minor inconvenience, I thought. The prairie stretched endlessly on either side of the two-lane blacktop, dead grass rustling in the wind like whispers. No streetlights out here, just the endless parade of reflective markers and my high beams cutting through the darkness. The moon hung low and bloated in the sky, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. Around 8:10 p.m., the monotony started getting to me. You develop tricks to stay alert during these long stretches. I'd count the seconds between mile markers or make up stories about the few cars I passed. But that night, even my usual mental games weren't enough to keep the fatigue at bay. The turnout appeared like a mirage, a small gravel patch barely wide enough for my rig. My bladder had been complaining for the last 20 miles, so I pulled over, making sure my hazards were flashing. Standard procedure, even though I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. That's when I first noticed something was off. The air felt different here, heavier somehow, like the moments before a thunderstorm. But the sky was clear, stars scattered across the black expanse like spilled salt. As I walked to the edge of the turnout, my boots crunching on gravel, I saw it. The shrine wasn't large, maybe 3 feet tall at most. Someone had carefully stacked flat rocks into a crude pyramid, securing them with what looked like sinew or gut. At the top sat what I initially thought was an animal skull, bleached white by the sun. But as I moved closer, my flashlight beam catching it at different angles, I realized it was human. The skull wasn't the only thing wrong with that shrine. Woven through the rocks were strips of fabric. What I first thought was colored yarn turned out to be pieces of clothing, frayed and weathered but still recognizable. A fragment of blue denim, a strip of what might have been a red dress, a piece of a leather work glove, cracked and stiff with age. Each piece had been deliberately placed, tied into complex knots that reminded me of the friendship bracelets my daughter used to make before the divorce. 20 years of police work teaches you to trust your instincts. Mine were screaming at me to get back in the truck and drive. But that same cop instinct that got me into trouble back in Chicago kept me rooted there, playing my flashlight beam across the shrine. Something about those fabric strips bothered me. They weren't old enough. Everything else about the shrine looked ancient, but those pieces of clothing couldn't have been there more than a few months. I pulled out my phone, thinking I should document this. No signal, not unusual out here in the middle of nowhere. I took a few photos anyway, though something in the back of my mind told me they wouldn't turn out. Looking back, I wish I'd listened to that voice. The wind picked up as I walked back to the truck, bringing with it a smell that didn't belong. Most people think the prairie is odorless, but you get to know its scents: sage, dust, the occasional whiff of cattle from distant ranches. This was different, organic, wrong, like turning over a log and finding something decomposing underneath. Back in the cab, I tried to shake off the unease. Probably just some local kids playing pranks, or maybe a memorial site I didn't understand. The clock read 9:17 p.m. I had another 4 hours of driving ahead of me if I wanted to stay on schedule. The highway stretched ahead, empty and dark. The moon had disappeared behind clouds that hadn't been there before, leaving only my headlights to cut through the darkness. I clicked on the radio, hoping to find something to keep me company. Static, all frequencies, not even the usual late-night preachers or country music that usually filtered through out here. By 10:30 p.m., my eyes were starting to burn. The white lines on the road seemed to writhe like snakes, and twice I caught myself drifting toward the shoulder. When the sign for a rest stop appeared, it felt like divine intervention. Truck parking 1 mile. Simple block letters, reflective paint catching my headlights, standard DOT sign, nothing special about it. Except, I could have sworn it wasn't there when my lights first hit it. The rest stop was bigger than I expected. A sprawling gravel lot with spaces for at least 20 rigs. 3 other trucks were already parked for the night, their cabs dark. I pulled into a spot near the middle, backing in with the practice of thousands of similar stops. Force of habit made me check my mirrors as I cut the engine. That's when I noticed something odd. The other trucks didn't have any markings. No company logos, no DOT numbers, just plain white trailers like props on a movie set. I should have noticed sooner, should have kept driving. But fatigue does strange things to your mind, makes you dismiss the obvious warning signs. I heated up a microwave dinner chicken and mashed potatoes that tasted like the container they came in, and settled into my bunk for the night. The routine was comforting. Check the doors, locked, place my gun in easy reach, old habits, set the alarm for 5 a.m. Sleep came quickly, but it didn't last. I woke to the sound of scratching, not the gentle scrape of tree branches. There weren't any trees here anyway, but deliberate, methodical scratching, like someone dragging their nails across the truck's aluminum panels. The sound moved slowly around the vehicle, punctuated by something that might have been breathing or might have been the wind. The dashboard clock read 2:17 a.m. The lot was pitch black. Even the safety lights that usually illuminate these places were out. I lay perfectly still in my bunk, listening to that scratching make its way around my truck. My hand found the grip of my Glock, the familiar texture bringing little comfort. The scratching stopped at my door. For a long moment there was only silence, then a thud on the roof, heavy footsteps moving with purpose. The whole truck shook with each impact. Training kicked in. I moved to the driver's seat, gun ready, and hit the high beams. The figure that dropped in front of my truck was wrong in every way that mattered. 7 feet tall at least, but the proportions were off. Arms too long, joints bending in ways they shouldn't. The deer skin around its waist looked fresh, still dripping. Its face, what I could see of it through the matted hair and beard, was almost human. Almost. But the eyes reflected my headlights like an animal's. And the teeth. God, the teeth were all wrong, like someone had jammed broken glass into its gums. It smiled at me. That's what broke me. Not the size, not the wrongness of its movement, but that smile. Like it knew me. Like it had been waiting. I threw the truck into gear just as it reached for the door handle. The metal screamed as those claws dug in, leaving deep furrows in the steel. The engine roared and I floored it, feeling resistance as the creature held on, then sudden release as I hit the highway. In my mirrors I saw it standing in the middle of the road, not chasing, not moving at all, just watching, smiling that glass-toothed smile. I drove straight through until dawn, crossing the state line into North Dakota as the sun came up, pulled into a busy truck stop, ordered the biggest coffee they had, and finally looked at my truck in the daylight. The claw marks were gone. Not faded or repaired, gone like they'd never existed. My phone showed no photos from the shrine, just an error message about corrupted files. I filed a police report in Bismarck. The officers were professional, took down every detail, promised to investigate. A week later they called to tell me they'd found the rest stop. Empty gravel lot, no signs of damage, no other reports of strange sightings. They suggested stress, fatigue, maybe road hypnosis. That was 6 years ago. I still drive, but never that route. Never at night if I can help it. I've learned every bypass and alternate road between Seattle and Minneapolis. The company thinks I'm eccentric. Let them. Because sometimes on long nights when I'm parked at a crowded truck stop, I catch a whiff of that wrong smell. And in my mirrors, just at the edge of the lot where the light doesn't quite reach, I see something tall standing very still, watching, waiting. I know what it wants. It's the same thing it wanted that night, to show me that all our rules, all our civilized explanations and logical assumptions are just a thin veneer. There are older things out there in the dark spaces between cities, things that remember when they were gods, things that are patient, and sometimes they get hungry for more than just flesh. By the time I finally decided to share this story, 3 years had passed since that day in the Chibula National Forest. I'm Elvin Archer, and I've spent most of my life in New Mexico. Anyone who knows me will tell you I'm not the type to exaggerate or chase attention. Before everything happened, I was just another guy trying to make ends meet, working as a mechanic at Martinez Auto in Albuquerque, living paycheck to paycheck in a small apartment off Central Avenue. The events I'm about to describe took place in October 2021. I remember the date clearly because it was right after I'd finished a particularly rough month at work. We'd lost 2 mechanics to better-paying jobs in Santa Fe, which meant longer hours for those of us who remained. Between the stress of covering extra shifts and the mounting bills, I felt like I was drowning in the monotony of everyday life. Hunting had always been my escape. There's something about being alone in the wilderness that helps put things in perspective. I'd been going to Chibula since I was a kid, learned every trail and ridge from my father before he passed. The familiar scent of pine needles and juniper, the way the sun painted the mountains gold at dawn. It was home in a way my apartment never could be. I planned the trip meticulously, as I always did. 5 days of solitude, just me and my Winchester Model 70 and .30-06, the same rifle I'd used for the past decade. I'd chosen a remote area in the Mount Taylor Ranger District, about 3 hours from Albuquerque. It was elk season, and I had my license, but honestly the hunt was secondary to simply getting away from everything. The drive out was uneventful. I took Highway 40 west, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of amber and rose. The radio kept cutting out as I got further from civilization, static eventually replacing the morning news entirely. By the time I turned onto Forest Road 193, the sun was high enough to cast sharp shadows through the ponderosa pines. My usual camping spot was about 2 miles up an old logging trail, far enough from the main road that I rarely saw another person. The October air was crisp, hovering around 65 degrees when I started setting up camp. I had my routine down to a science: tent first, then the fire pit, followed by securing my food in a bear-proof container well away from where I'd be sleeping. Everything felt normal at first. The familiar sounds of birds, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the wind through the trees. It was exactly what I'd come for. But as the afternoon wore on, something began to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a creeping sensation at the base of my skull, like when you think someone's watching you. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the stress from work following me into the wilderness. I spent the remainder of the daylight gathering firewood and setting up my hunting blind about half a mile from camp, overlooking a small meadow where I'd seen elk sign in previous years. That first night, the temperature dropped to near freezing, typical for October in these mountains. I had a small fire going and was heating up some beef stew I'd brought when I first noticed the silence. It came on gradually. First the crickets stopped, then the nocturnal birds fell quiet. Anyone who spent time in the wilderness knows that sudden silence usually means a predator is nearby. Mountain lions aren't uncommon in these parts, so I made sure my rifle was within reach and added more wood to the fire. But this silence felt different, heavier somehow. Even the wind seemed to die, leaving nothing but the soft crackle of my campfire and the thundering of my own heartbeat in my ears. I've experienced similar situations before, the woods going quiet when a bear or mountain lion passes through, but they never lasted more than a few minutes. This silence stretched on for hours. I barely slept that night, drifting in and out of uneasy consciousness, jerking awake at every snap of a twig or shift of the wind. By morning I was exhausted and irritable, angry at myself for letting paranoia get the better of me. The familiar sounds of the forest had returned with the dawn, making the previous night's anxiety seem foolish in the harsh light of day. I decided to hunt anyway, figuring the physical activity would help clear my head. The morning was cold, my breath forming thick clouds as I made my way to the blind I'd set up the previous day. The sun was just beginning to peek over the eastern ridge, casting long shadows through the trees. Perfect hunting conditions. For 3 hours, I sat in complete stillness, watching the meadow for any sign of movement. The only wildlife I saw were a few Steller's jays and a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. Around mid-morning I decided to try still hunting, moving slowly through the woods, stopping frequently to scan for game. I headed northeast, working my way up a gentle slope where the ponderosa pines gave way to spruce and fir. The ground was carpeted with fallen needles, making it easier to move quietly. The air had warmed to maybe 50 degrees, and a slight breeze carried the scent of sage and pine. Under normal circumstances, it would have been perfect. That's when I caught the first whiff of it, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach turn. Anyone who's ever stumbled across a rotting carcass knows the smell, but this was different. There was something else mixed in, something chemical, almost like burning plastic. Training and experience told me to back away slowly, to return to camp and try a different area. But something else, something deeper and more primal, urged me forward. It was like being pulled by an invisible thread, my feet moving almost of their own accord toward the source of that horrific smell. The forest had gone silent again, but I was too focused on what lay ahead to fully register it at the time. I moved carefully, each step measured and deliberate, my rifle held ready. The smell grew stronger as I approached a small clearing, and that's when I saw it, the elk carcass. What was left of it, anyway? I've field-dressed countless animals over the years. I've seen what bears and mountain lions can do to a carcass. This was different. The elk had been opened. That's the only word I can think of that comes close to describing it. It wasn't torn apart or mauled. It was precisely split, like someone had unzipped it from throat to tail. The organs were laid out in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, each one placed with careful precision on the blood-soaked ground. My first thought was that this must be the work of humans, poachers maybe, or some sick individual with too much time on their hands. But as I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I heard movement behind me. The sound was subtle, just the soft whisper of something moving through the underbrush. But in the absolute silence that had fallen over the forest, it might as well have been a gunshot. I turned slowly, my rifle already halfway to my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. What emerged from the trees defied everything I knew about the natural world. At first glance it appeared almost human, bipedal, roughly 6 feet tall, with a head, torso, and limbs. But that's where any resemblance to humanity ended. Its skin was a sickly pale gray, stretched too tight over an impossibly thin frame. The proportions were all wrong: arms too long, fingers like spiders' legs ending in dark curved points. Its joints bent in ways that shouldn't be possible, like there were extra segments in its limbs. But it was the face that haunts me most. The eyes were set too far apart, larger than human eyes should be, and completely black, except for pinpricks of amber light in their centers. The nose was just 2 vertical slits, and below that, God, that mouth. It split the face in a grotesque parody of a smile, filled with row upon row of needle-sharp teeth, like a shark's mouth stretched across a human face. Our eyes met, and in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at something intelligent. There was calculation in those eyes, a cold awareness that turned my blood to ice. The creature tilted its head at an impossible angle, studying me with an almost clinical detachment. Then it moved. The speed was incredible. One moment it was 20 feet away, the next it was barely 5. I raised my rifle and fired without conscious thought. The shot echoed through the silent forest like a thunderclap. I know I hit it. Saw the impact just below its right shoulder, but it didn't bleed. The bullet hole just closed like water rippling back together. That's when I ran. I'd like to say I made a strategic retreat, that I kept my head and moved with purpose. But that would be a lie. I ran in blind panic, crashing through the underbrush like a wounded animal. Behind me I could hear it moving, not the sound of footsteps, but a sort of sliding whisper through the trees that somehow seemed worse. The terrain was rough, the ground rising sharply as I fled uphill. My lungs burned with each breath and my legs felt like lead. I still had my rifle clutched in a white-knuckled grip, but I knew now it would be useless against whatever was pursuing me. That's when I made my first mistake. I looked back. It was moving through the trees in a way that denied physics, its body twisting and flowing like smoke, but somehow solid. Those amber eyes locked onto mine again, and its mouth split wider in what I can only describe as anticipation. My second mistake came immediately after. With my attention behind me, I missed the root jutting from the ground. My foot caught it hard and I went down. The impact drove the air from my lungs and I felt something snap in my ankle. The pain was immediate and intense, but the adrenaline coursing through my system pushed it to the background. I scrambled to my feet, now limping heavily. The thing was closer now, moving with that same fluid grace. But it wasn't rushing to catch me. It was almost playing, like a cat toying with a mouse. That realization somehow made everything worse. What saved me, I think, was the sun. As I stumbled through the forest, I noticed the creature staying to the shadows, never crossing directly through the patches of sunlight that broke through the canopy. Using my hunter's knowledge of the terrain, I made for a clearing I knew was ahead. My ankle screamed with every step, but I forced myself forward. The clearing was maybe 50 yards across, completely exposed to the afternoon sun. I broke through the tree line and half ran, half crawled to the center, finally collapsing in the grass. For several long minutes, I lay there gasping for breath, expecting at any moment to feel those razor-sharp teeth. But when I finally found the courage to look up, I saw it standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a massive ponderosa pine. It wasn't advancing. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Me in the sunlight, it in the shadows. Those amber eyes never left me, and that terrible smile never wavered. Then, as the sun shifted and shadows began to creep across the clearing, I knew I had to move. Getting back to camp was an ordeal. I used my rifle as a makeshift crutch, keeping to open areas as much as possible. Every shadow made me flinch, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. But somehow, I made it back just as dusk was settling in. I broke down camp in record time, throwing everything haphazardly into my truck. The drive back to Albuquerque was a blur of pain and paranoia, constantly checking my rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was back in the city, surrounded by the comforting glow of streetlights and the sounds of civilization. The next few weeks were hell. I told the guys at work I'd sprained my ankle hiking, but that was the least of my problems. Sleep became almost impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, those teeth, those knowing eyes. I started sleeping with lights on, then stopped sleeping altogether for days at a time. The worst part was the doubt. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Was I losing my mind? I started researching, spending countless hours online looking for anything similar to what I'd encountered. It took months of digging through folklore and historical accounts before I found anything that matched what I'd seen. The Navajo have stories of skinwalkers, Naldlushi, shape-shifting witches who can take animal form. But what I saw wasn't quite that either. It was something older, something that predated even those ancient tales. I found scattered references in the journals of Spanish explorers from the 1500s, describing encounters with demons that walk like men. The Pueblo peoples had their own stories of creatures that lived in the deep forests, things that were neither human nor animal, but something in between. The more I researched, the more I found similar accounts spanning centuries. Different cultures, different names, but always the same basic description: unnaturally tall, pale figures with too many teeth and eyes that held an ancient intelligence. It's been 3 years now, and I haven't been back to Cibola. I still hunt, but never alone, and never in that part of New Mexico. The ankle healed, though it still aches when the weather changes. The nightmares have mostly subsided, though they never completely go away. But something else has changed, something fundamental. It's like once you've seen behind the curtain, you can't unsee it. I notice things now that I would have missed before. The way shadows sometimes move against the wind, the sudden silences that fall over busy streets for no apparent reason, the glimpses of pale figures in peripheral vision that vanish when you turn to look. I've learned to live with it, this new awareness of a world that exists alongside our own, but separate from it. Most days I can almost convince myself it was all a product of stress and isolation. Almost. But some nights, when I'm driving home late and catch movement in my headlights, or when I wake up at 3 a.m. to complete silence, I remember those amber eyes and that terrible smile, and I know that there are things in this world that we're not meant to understand, ancient things that live in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. I still have my hunting license, and my rifle still sits in its case by my bed. But these days I find myself wondering, when I was out there in those woods, was I really the hunter, or was I always the prey? I've never told this story properly before. Maybe that's because I still wake up some nights, heart pounding, thinking I hear that inhuman screech echoing through the Olympic Peninsula rainforest. Or maybe it's because I know how it sounds: a delivery driver, an abandoned house, something that shouldn't exist. But I need to get this down, if only so someone else might learn from my mistakes. Call me Wyatt. You might as well know the name of the dead man walking, right? That's what I considered myself after that day in 2019, when I was 23 and too desperate for cash to listen to my instincts. I was working my way through community college back then, picking up whatever gigs I could find on those delivery apps. The kind where people need something moved from point A to point B, no questions asked. The pay wasn't great, but it beat flipping burgers, and the flexible hours let me attend classes. Most jobs were mundane: helping people move furniture, delivering packages that wouldn't fit in standard mail, that sort of thing. The listing that caught my eye that foggy October morning seemed simple enough. A woman needed an antique doll collection transported from a storage facility in Port Angeles to a remote location near Forks. The pay was better than usual, $300 for what looked like a few hours' work. I should have wondered why. I remember checking my bank account before accepting the job: $46.73. Rent was due in a week. The choice didn't feel like a choice at all. The woman who posted the job, she called herself Miss Green, had a voice that sounded oddly flat over the phone, like someone trying too hard to sound normal. She insisted the delivery had to happen that day before sunset. When I asked why she couldn't pick up the collection herself, she gave some vague excuse about car trouble. I didn't press. Money is money, right? The storage facility was one of those anonymous concrete blocks on the outskirts of town, Unit 237. The manager let me in with barely a glance at my ID. Inside, a single cardboard box sat in the center of the otherwise empty unit. It was larger than I expected, maybe 3 feet on each side, sealed with what looked like excessive amounts of packing tape. No labels, no markings, just a box that felt too heavy for what was supposed to be inside. I should have walked away then. But $300 was $300. The drive started normally enough. Highway 101 hugged the coastline, offering glimpses of the steel-gray Pacific through gaps in the evergreens. The Olympics loomed to the south, their peaks lost in clouds that seemed to be sinking lower by the minute. I had the radio on, some classic rock station that kept cutting out as I got further from civilization. The GPS led me onto progressively smaller roads until I was crawling along what amounted to a logging trail. The forest pressed in close here, massive Sitka spruces and western red cedars draped in hanging moss that seemed to absorb both light and sound. The fog had thickened into a proper soup, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet ahead. My headlights caught the water droplets, creating a disorienting effect like I was driving through static. That's when my phone lost signal. No bars, no data, no GPS. Just a blank screen reflecting my increasingly worried face. I'd written down the directions as a backup, thank God, but being cut off from the outside world made my skin crawl. The box in the truck bed seemed to grow heavier with each mile. I tried to distract myself by texting a joke to my roommate about vampires. This was Twilight Country after all. But the message wouldn't send. It just sat there, mocking me with its failure to deliver. The trees pressed closer, their branches scraping against the sides of my truck like skeletal fingers. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, I found the turnoff Miss Green had described. No mailbox, no house number, just a rutted dirt track barely wide enough for my vehicle. The coordinates matched my written directions, but everything in me screamed to turn around. I wish I had listened. The house appeared suddenly through the fog, a 2-story Victorian that looked like it had been transported straight from a horror movie set. Gray paint peeling, windows dark, wraparound porch sagging like a broken jaw. An old Ford pickup, probably from the 80s, sat in what passed for a driveway, its red paint dulled to the color of dried blood. Rust had eaten through the body in places, and all 4 tires were flat. It clearly hadn't moved in years. No fresh tire tracks in the mud, no lights, no sign anyone lived here at all. I sat in my truck for a long moment, engine idling, watching the fog swirl around the house like it was trying to consume it. The box seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision, though I told myself it was just my imagination. The only sound was the tick-tick-tick of my cooling engine and the soft patter of water droplets falling from the trees. Professional obligation finally won out over instinct. I grabbed my flashlight, one of those heavy mag lights that can double as a weapon, and approached the front door. Each step on the porch boards produced a groan that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. I knocked. The sound echoed oddly, like the house was hollow inside. No response. I knocked again, harder this time. Delivery for Miss Green. My voice sounded thin and afraid. That's when I heard it, a scratching sound from inside, like something being dragged across wooden floors. Then a thump, then silence. "Hello," I called out, pressing my ear to the door. "I have your package, the doll collection." More scratching, closer now. And underneath it, a sound that made my blood run cold, a wet, gurgling moan, barely audible but unmistakably human. Or almost human. I tried the door handle, telling myself I was just being thorough, secretly hoping it would be locked. It wasn't. The door swung open with a creak that would have seemed cliché in any other situation. The smell hit me first, decay and formaldehyde, sweet and chemical and wrong. The entryway was dark. What little daylight made it through the fog revealed shapes covered in dusty sheets. Furniture maybe, or sculptures. Their outlines seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight app. The beam caught dust motes swirling in the air like angry insects. That scratching sound was louder now, coming from what I guessed was the living room. Every horror movie I'd ever seen screamed at me to run, but some morbid curiosity pushed me forward. That, and the thought of that empty bank account. The living room was larger than it should have been, given the house's exterior dimensions. More sheet-covered shapes loomed in the corners, but it was what crouched in the center of the room that turned my world inside out. My flashlight beam caught it in profile first, a thing that had maybe once been human but wasn't anymore. It was naked, its skin a patchwork of different textures and colors, like pieces had been removed and replaced. Where its eyes should have been, something reflective caught the light, like polished coins had been sewn into the sockets. It was hunched over something on the floor, something red and wet that I refused to look at directly. Long, matted hair hung in ropes around its face, and its hands, dear God, its hands were wrong, too many joints, too long, ending in what looked like surgical steel instead of fingernails. Then it turned toward me, and I saw its mouth. No lips, just teeth exposed in a permanent rictus grin, yellow and sharp and too numerous. That mouth opened impossibly wide as it tasted the air, like a snake scenting its prey. I'd like to say I acted with courage or purpose. The truth is, blind panic took over. I tried to run but tripped over something solid hidden under one of those sheets. I went down hard, my flashlight spinning away across the floor. Its beam caught flashes of movement as the creature launched itself toward me with that spider-like grace. My hand found something solid, a wooden handle, smooth with age. The creature slammed into me, knocking me against the wall hard enough to drive the air from my lungs. Its face was inches from mine now, that lidless gaze boring into me as something wet and gray snaked out from between those teeth. Pure survival instinct took over. I swung whatever I'd grabbed as hard as I could. There was resistance, then a meaty thunk, and the creature released me with a shriek that shattered the nearest window. The sound went straight through my skull like an ice pick, setting my teeth vibrating in their sockets. I scrambled to my feet, still clutching what I now saw was an old woodcutting axe. The creature was already recovering, moving with jerky, wrong angles as it oriented on me again. Dark fluid leaked from a gash in its shoulder, but the wound was already pulling itself closed like a time-lapse video of healing. I ran. The creature pursued, crashing through the front door like it was made of paper. Splinters showered my face as I sprinted to my truck. The key fumbled in the ignition as that horrible screech came closer. The engine roared to life just as something heavy landed in the truck bed. I floored it, not even thinking about turning around. Branches whipped against the windows as I reversed down that narrow track at speeds that should have killed me. The thing in the back was thrashing, and I heard the sound of tearing cardboard. Another inhuman shriek, this one somehow triumphant. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, and even then I kept going until I reached the first gas station I saw. That's where the adrenaline finally wore off enough for me to really process what had happened. I pulled over and threw up until there was nothing left but bile. When I finally worked up the courage to check the truck bed, the box had been torn to shreds. Whatever had been inside, and they weren't dolls, I can tell you that much, was gone. But there was something else, something that still haunts my dreams. Scattered among the cardboard fragments were what looked like scraps of leather, but the texture was wrong. Some still had hair attached, and there were other things, metal things that gleamed dully in the fluorescent lights of the gas station. Surgical implements, I realized with growing horror. Tools for removing and preserving parts. I called the police, of course. They took my statement, but I could tell they didn't believe me. Can't blame them, really. They sent units out to the house, but by then the fog had lifted and there was nothing to find. No blood, no broken door, no evidence of anyone living there for years. The property records led nowhere. Shell companies within shell companies, dead ends all around. The woman who hired me, the phone number was disconnected, the payment app account deleted. The storage facility manager had no record of Unit 237 being rented that day. It was like the whole thing had been engineered to make me sound crazy. But here's what keeps me up at night. What makes me check and double-check my locks even now. In the years since, I've done research. There are patterns if you know where to look. Missing persons reports in that area going back decades. Always individuals who wouldn't be missed right away. Drifters, solo hikers, people between jobs. The police files mentioned strange wound patterns on the few bodies that were found, like someone had been harvesting. The local indigenous peoples have stories about creatures that walk in human shape but aren't human at all. Things that steal not just lives but identities, building new bodies from stolen parts. The old-timers call that part of the peninsula the hungry ground and won't go near it after dark. I've moved away from Washington State since then, changed my name, went off-grid as much as possible in this connected age. But sometimes when the fog rolls in thick and the shadows grow long, I swear I can hear that scratching sound again, and I wonder, was I allowed to escape that day? Was I meant to spread this story, to attract more curious souls to that hungry ground? Or am I just bait, slowly going mad, waiting for something that wears stolen faces to finally come collect the parts it marked as its own? I don't check delivery apps anymore. Some payments aren't worth the price. It was March 2021 when I spent that fateful time in the Everglades. I was 32 then, working as a freelance web developer in Tampa, and anyone who's ventured into those swamplands will tell you it's like stepping into another world entirely. The Everglades have this ancient quality about them, a primordial atmosphere where you can almost feel time dissolving around you, where alligators still reign supreme just as they have for millions of years. Looking back, I should have recognized that the strangeness of the place wasn't just atmosphere, it was a warning. My name is Elric, and before all this happened, I was your typical tech guy. Spent my days hunched over a laptop, debugging code for clients, and living off coffee and takeout. I wasn't unhappy exactly, but there was this gnawing emptiness that came from spending too many hours staring at screens instead of living. When my cousin Jasper's message popped up on my phone about a week-long backcountry camping trip, it felt like an answer to something I hadn't even known I was asking. Jasper was everything I wasn't, an outdoor enthusiast who worked as a wilderness guide in Colorado. He had this infectious enthusiasm about nature that made even the most mundane hike sound like an epic adventure. "Come on, cuz," he wrote. "Time to disconnect and remember what real life feels like." The timing seemed perfect. I just wrapped up a big project, and the thought of escaping the artificial glow of my monitors was suddenly irresistible. I should have done more research, should have prepared better. But Jasper assured me he knew what he was doing, and I trusted him. We met up in Naples, Florida, where he'd already arranged our gear rental, including a rugged four-wheeler that had seen better days. The rental guy, a weathered local named Roy, gave us an odd look when Jasper mentioned our destination. "You boys heading deep in?" Roy asked, his sun-creased face showing concern. "Might want to reconsider. Had some strange reports lately. Couple of hikers went missing last month." Jasper laughed it off. "We'll be fine. I've got satellite navigation and emergency beacons." Roy shrugged, but I caught something in his expression, a flicker of genuine worry that should have set off alarm bells. Instead, I helped Jasper load our gear: tents, supplies, emergency medical kit, enough food and water for 10 days, though we only planned to stay for 7. The four-wheeler's suspension groaned under the weight. The journey in was grueling. We followed established trails as far as we could, but eventually those gave way to barely marked paths that seemed to disappear entirely at times. The air grew thicker, more oppressive, heavy with the scent of decay and stagnant water. Mosquitoes swarmed us in clouds despite our repellent, and the constant drone of insects created this maddening white noise that made it hard to think. We had to abandon the four-wheeler about 4 miles in, marking its location carefully on our GPS. From there, we shouldered our packs and began the real trek. The water level varied unpredictably, sometimes ankle-deep, sometimes reaching our knees. Every step had to be careful, calculated. Jasper led the way, occasionally consulting his compass and GPS unit, though the tree canopy made satellite reception spotty at best. The first warning signs appeared on our second day of hiking. We found unusual tracks in the mud, too large for a deer, wrong shape for a bear or panther. Jasper suggested it might be from a feral hog, but something about the impression seemed off. The stride length was too long, and there was this strange pattern to them that I couldn't quite place. We made camp that evening on a raised hammock of land, one of the few dry spots we'd found. The setting sun painted everything in shades of amber and shadow, and for a while it felt almost peaceful. Jasper got a small fire going and heated up some freeze-dried meals. We sat there, eating and talking about nothing in particular, while the swamp came alive with night sounds around us. That's when I first noticed the silence. It didn't happen all at once, more like a gradual dimming of the natural chorus of frogs and insects. One moment the air was filled with their calls, and the next, nothing. Complete stillness. Even Jasper noticed it, pausing mid-sentence with his spork halfway to his mouth. "Weather change coming, maybe," he suggested, but his voice had lost some of its usual confidence. The silence lasted for perhaps 2 minutes, though it felt much longer. Then from somewhere in the darkness beyond our firelight came a sound I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't quite a growl, not exactly a screech, something in between, but wrong somehow, like someone trying to imitate animal sounds without ever having heard them properly. Jasper reached for the rifle he'd brought for emergencies. "Probably just a bobcat," he said, but we both knew that wasn't true. Bobcats don't make sounds like that. We didn't sleep much that night. The thing outside our camp moved around periodically, never coming into view but making its presence known through broken branches and that awful vocalization. Sometimes it seemed to be testing our perimeter, looking for weak spots. By morning we found deep gouges in the trees surrounding our campsite, not normal claw marks but precise, almost geometric patterns carved into the bark about 7 feet off the ground. Jasper wanted to press on. "We're miles from the nearest exit point," he reasoned. "Moving forward to our planned site might be safer than trying to backtrack." I argued for turning back, but he convinced me that we were better off sticking to our original route. The planned site was on higher ground, he said, more defensible. That decision haunts me still. The next day's hike was tense. Every sound made us jump. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threats. The swamp itself felt different, more hostile somehow. The water had taken on an oily sheen, and the vegetation seemed darker, more twisted. We found more of those strange tracks, fresher now, and occasionally glimpsed movement in our peripheral vision that vanished when we turned to look. It was mid-afternoon when I made my fatal mistake. Jasper had stopped to check our position, and I needed to answer nature's call. "Don't go far," he warned, but I wanted privacy. I walked just far enough to be out of sight, finding a relatively dry spot behind a large cypress. That's when I saw it, the clearing. The vegetation had been cleared in an unnaturally perfect circle, maybe 30 feet in diameter. At its center stood an ancient cypress tree, its trunk twisted into shapes that seemed to defy natural growth patterns. Scattered around the base were bones, not just 1 or 2, but dozens of complete skeletons. Some were clearly animal remains, but others were unmistakably human. I should have run, should have called out to Jasper. Instead, I stood there, paralyzed by a mixture of horror and fascination. The bones seemed arranged in a pattern, radiating out from the central tree like spokes on a wheel. Many showed signs of precise cuts, not the random trauma you'd expect from animal attacks, but deliberate, almost surgical marks. The sound that finally broke my trance wasn't loud, just a soft scraping noise from above. I looked up and my world shifted permanently. It clung to the cypress trunk about 20 feet up, a thing that should not exist. In the filtered sunlight, its skin looked like ancient bark, gnarled and gray, stretched over a frame that was almost but not quite humanoid. Its limbs were wrong, too long, too many joints, fingers that extended into foot-long talons. Where a face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of that bark-like skin, but somehow I knew it was looking at me. Time seemed to stop. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The thing on the tree tilted what passed for its head, studying me with that blank face. Then it moved. The speed was impossible. One moment it was on the tree, the next it was dropping to the ground with fluid grace that defied physics. Its limbs unfolded like a grotesque flower blooming, and it rose to its full height, easily 9 or 10 feet tall. I ran. Blind panic took over. I crashed through the undergrowth, barely registering the thorns that tore at my clothes and skin. Behind me, I could hear it pursuing, not running exactly, but moving with a terrible efficiency through the swamp. Those wrong limbs seemed perfectly adapted to the terrain, allowing it to flow over and around obstacles that slowed me down. The sounds it made during the chase were worse than anything I'd heard before, a mixture of clicking and that awful screeching, punctuated by what sounded disturbingly like human words spoken backward. My lungs burned, my legs trembled, but pure terror kept me moving. I have no idea how long I ran or in what direction. The swamp became a blur of green and brown, meaningless shapes that I pushed through without thought. At some point, I splashed through deeper water and felt something brush against my leg, probably an alligator, but at that moment, it seemed like the lesser threat. I found Jasper by pure luck, nearly colliding with him as he was searching for me. One look at my face told him something was terribly wrong. Before I could speak, we both heard it, that clicking sound, closer now, accompanied by the crack of breaking branches. "Run," I managed to gasp. "We have to run." We fled together, Jasper quickly taking the lead since he still had some energy left. He tried to guide us toward where we'd left the four-wheeler, but in our panic, we lost all sense of direction. The thing behind us seemed to be herding us, sometimes getting closer, sometimes backing off, but always there. The sun was setting when we stumbled onto a maintenance trail. By some miracle, a truck was passing, a Florida Fish and Wildlife vehicle driven by a ranger named Miguel Rodriguez. He took one look at our blood-streaked, mud-covered appearances and immediately radioed for backup. The official report lists us as lost hikers suffering from dehydration and possible heat exhaustion. They found our abandoned four-wheeler 2 days later, but our other gear was never recovered. The rangers searched the area where we claimed to have seen the creature, but found nothing unusual. No clearing, no bones, no strange tracks. Jasper doesn't talk about what happened. He moved back to Colorado and, as far as I know, hasn't set foot in Florida since. I've done research trying to make sense of what we encountered. The closest thing I've found is in Seminole legends about the Stikini, a shape-shifting creature that hunts in the deep swamps. But the descriptions don't quite match what I saw. I've been to therapists, taken medication for PTSD, tried to convince myself it was all a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there. Sometimes, late at night, I look at satellite images of the Everglades, millions of acres of wilderness where anything could hide. I think about the missing persons reports that pop up every few months, the ones that never get resolved. And I wonder how many others have seen what I saw, have run from that thing in the swamp. How many weren't as lucky as we were? The physical scars have healed, but other things linger. I can't stand the sound of breaking branches. The sight of Spanish moss makes me break out in cold sweats. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can hear that clicking sound, that awful screech that's almost words. I still work in tech, but I've moved to Arizona. There are no swamps here, no thick forests where things can hide. The desert feels safer somehow, everything exposed under the bright sun. But even here, thousands of miles from the Everglades, I never quite shake the feeling that somewhere out there, that faceless thing is waiting, watching, hungry. This is my warning to anyone thinking of venturing deep into the Everglades. Stick to the marked trails, the tourist areas. Don't go wandering off alone. And if you hear that sound, that terrible clicking screech that sounds almost like words, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because some things in this world aren't meant to be understood, and some corners of wilderness should remain unexplored. The truth is, we think we've tamed this world, mapped every inch of it, explained away all its mysteries. But there are places where the wild still rules, where ancient things still lurk in the shadows. I know because I've seen one, and every night I pray I never see it again. It happened back in August 2019, down in the Everglades. I'm Declan, and until then, I'd never strayed far from Chicago's concrete canyons. But sometimes life in the city starts to feel like a cage, you know? Like you're breathing recycled air and living someone else's routine. That's when the wilderness starts calling, promising something real. I'd been working 60-hour weeks at a consulting firm, staring at spreadsheets until my vision blurred. When my old college roommate Zeke suggested a week-long getaway to Florida, it seemed like exactly what I needed. Zeke had always been the adventurous one. Even back in school, he was the guy organizing weekend camping trips while I made excuses to stay in my dorm. The rental cabin was cheaper than we expected, which should have been our first warning. It sat on stilts about 20 feet above the water, accessible only by a narrow wooden walkway that creaked with every step. The whole structure looked like it had been fighting a losing battle against the elements for decades. But it was ours for the week, and Zeke's enthusiasm was infectious. "This is living, Deck," he boomed, dropping his gear on the worn floorboards. "No emails, no meetings, no traffic, just us and Mother Nature." He was already unpacking his fishing gear, practically bouncing with excitement. The cabin's interior matched its exterior, functional but worn. 2 narrow beds with thin mattresses, a kitchenette with a propane stove, and a bathroom that looked like it had last been updated during the Carter administration. But the screened-in porch offered a view that made up for everything else. An endless expanse of cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, their knobby knees breaking the surface of the dark water like ancient creatures coming up for air. That first afternoon we tried our luck fishing. Zeke had bought all the gear we'd need in Miami: rods, tackle, bait, even those ridiculous bucket hats with fishing lures stuck in them, but after 3 hours we hadn't gotten so much as a nibble. "Water's dead out here," Zeke muttered, squinting at the glassy surface. I noticed he kept checking his phone, probably hoping for a signal that wouldn't come. The humidity was oppressive, making every movement feel like swimming through soup. It was around sunset when I first noticed the smell. At first I thought it might be our bait gone bad in the heat, but this was different. A deep, cloying sweetness underneath something sharp and metallic. It reminded me of the time I'd found a dead rat behind my radiator, but magnified 100-fold. "You smell that?" I asked Zeke. He wrinkled his nose. "Probably just something died in the swamp. Circle of life and all that." But I caught him scanning the water's surface, as if expecting to see some bloated carcass floating by. Night fell quickly in the swamp. The darkness seemed to rise from the water itself, thick and absolute. Our battery-powered lantern created a small island of light on the porch, beyond which the world dissolved into impenetrable shadow. The insect chorus was deafening. Crickets, cicadas, and countless other creatures I couldn't name, all screaming their existence into the void. Then, around midnight, the sounds changed. It started with silence, a sudden cessation of the insect chorus that had been our constant companion. The quiet was so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Then came the splashing, not the casual plop of a fish or turtle, but something deliberate, something large. "Gator," Zeke said confidently, but his voice had lost some of its usual boom. "They're more active at night." The splashing moved closer, accompanied by a sound I still struggle to describe. Imagine a cat's purr, but deeper, wetted with something that might have been hunger or might have been pleasure. It emanated from somewhere in the darkness beyond our circle of light, moving in a way that suggested intelligence rather than random animal activity. I wanted to go inside, but Zeke was transfixed. He'd grabbed his camera, an expensive DSLR he'd bought specifically for the trip, and was pointing it into the darkness, trying to catch whatever was making those sounds. "This could be something big, Deck," he whispered, excitement creeping back into his voice. "Nobody's gotten good footage out here. Could be a new species, even." I wanted to remind him that if there were undiscovered species in the Everglades, someone would have found them by now. But before I could speak, we heard it, a sound that had no place in the natural world, like metal being torn apart, but organic, wet. It came from somewhere to our left, maybe 50 yards out in the swamp. This time, even Zeke couldn't pretend it was just a gator. We retreated inside, double-checking the locks on the doors and windows. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by more sounds. Scratching along the cabin's stilts, heavy breathing from just beyond the screened windows, and once what sounded distinctly like words in a language I'd never heard. Morning brought no relief. The humidity had thickened into a visible haze, and that smell, that sweet rotting smell, was stronger than ever. While making coffee, I noticed something odd about the water coming from the tap. It ran clear enough, but there was an oily sheen to it, and tiny dark particles that might have been sediment, but moved in ways sediment shouldn't. Zeke was already planning our day, spreading out a water-stained map on the kitchen table. "There's an old hunting camp about 2 miles deeper in," he said, tracing a route with his finger. "Local forums say there's been some weird sightings out that way. We should check it out." I tried to argue against it. The smart play was to cut our losses, head back to Miami, spend the rest of our vacation on South Beach, where the scariest thing we'd encounter would be the drink prices. But Zeke had that look in his eyes, the same one he'd get before doing something stupid back in college. "One quick trip," he promised. "We'll take the canoe, scout it out, be back before dark. Come on, Deck. When did you get so boring?" That was what did it, of course. No man wants to be called boring, especially not by his oldest friend. So I found myself loading up the canoe with water bottles, granola bars, and Zeke's camera gear. We pushed off around 10 in the morning, the sun already blazing overhead. The water grew shallower as we pressed deeper into the swamp, forcing us to navigate between cypress knees and submerged logs. The trees pressed closer together, their canopy blocking out most of the sunlight. The air grew thicker, if that was possible, and that smell, that goddamn smell, kept getting stronger. We'd been paddling for maybe an hour when we found the first body. It was wedged between 2 cypress knees, mostly submerged. At first I thought it was just another log. There was something wooden about its texture, like the water had begun to petrify it. Then I saw the hand, fingers splayed as if reaching for help that never came. Zeke, damn him, insisted on getting closer. The body belonged to a man, probably in his 50s, wearing the remains of what looked like expensive hiking gear. But what had been done to him? I've spent years trying to forget those details. The claw marks weren't like anything I'd seen before, not straight like a knife or jagged like an alligator's teeth. They curved around the body in spirals, as if whatever had killed him had been playing with its food. "We need to call someone," I said, my voice shaking. "The rangers, the police, someone." Zeke was already taking pictures. "No signal out here," he reminded me, "but look at these marks. This is evidence, Deck. Real evidence of something unknown." That's when we noticed the tracks leading away from the water's edge. They looked almost human, but wrong. Too long, too thin, with toes that extended into points like thorns. They led into the underbrush where the vegetation had been pushed aside with enough force to snap small branches. We followed the tracks for about 50 yards before they disappeared into a small clearing. The ground there was different, black and spongy like it had been burned. In the center was a pile of something, bones maybe, but not arranged in any natural way. They'd been woven together into a kind of structure, like a bird's nest built by something that had only seen birds in nightmares. Zeke was in his element, photographing everything, taking notes in his phone. I stood at the edge of the clearing, every instinct screaming at me to run. That's when I noticed the silence had fallen again. No insects, no birds, nothing but the sound of Zeke's camera shutter and my own heartbeat. "We need to go," I said. "Now." Zeke started to argue, but something in my voice must have gotten through to him. We made it back to the canoe in record time, though I swear the route looked different than it had before. Trees seemed to have moved. Channels that had been clear were now choked with vegetation. The sun was setting by the time we got back to the cabin. Zeke immediately connected his camera to his laptop, going through the photos while I tried to get my hands to stop shaking enough to make coffee. That's when he noticed something strange about the images. "This can't be right," he muttered, clicking through them faster. "Deck, come look at this." The photos from the clearing were corrupted somehow, not entirely gone, but distorted in ways that digital images shouldn't be. In each one there was something in the background, a shape that seemed to shift between frames, growing clearer as the sequence progressed. In the last photo it was almost distinct, a figure impossibly tall and thin, its proportions all wrong, like a child's drawing of a person brought to horrible life. Zeke was convinced he could clean up the images, reveal what had been lurking just out of sight. He set up his equipment on the porch, saying the light was better out there. I wanted to stop him, to drag him inside, but I knew how he got when he was focused on something. "Just give me an hour," he said. "This could be huge, Deck. Career-making huge." Those were the last words I ever heard him say. I was inside trying to force down some dinner when I heard the scream. Not of surprise or even fear. This was the sound of someone experiencing pain beyond their capacity to understand it. I ran to the porch in time to see the laptop hitting the water, Zeke nowhere in sight. There was blood on the railing and something else, long, thin strands of what looked like black seaweed. But they moved against the wind. I'd like to say I did the heroic thing, that I grabbed a weapon and went looking for my friend. But the truth is, I ran. I locked myself in the bathroom, wedged the toilet plunger under the doorknob for whatever good that would do, and sat there with my phone in one hand and a rusty razor in the other, trying to get even one bar of signal. The sounds that came from outside that night, I still hear them in my dreams, scratching at the walls, that wet, purring sound, and worst of all, Zeke's voice calling my name, not in pain or fear, but like he was trying to convince me to come out and play, like we were kids again, and he was trying to talk me into one more stupid adventure. I stayed in that bathroom until dawn. When the first light started seeping through the small window, I finally worked up the courage to come out. The cabin was a wreck, furniture overturned, walls scored with those same spiral marks we'd seen on the body. On the porch, I found Zeke's camera, the lens shattered. Next to it was a single footprint, one of those long thorn-toed marks, but fresh this time. The blood hadn't yet dried. I made it to the ranger station in record time, babbling my story to increasingly skeptical faces. They sent out search parties, of course, found the canoe, found some blood, never found Zeke or the body we'd discovered, or that strange nest in the clearing. The official report blamed it on an alligator attack, suggested that the stress and heat had made me imagine the rest. Maybe they're right. Maybe the swamp just got to me, played tricks with my mind. But I've spent the years since then researching, trying to make sense of what happened. I've found stories, old ones, passed down through generations of people who lived in those swamps. They speak of something ancient that lives in the deepest parts of the Everglades, something that came before humans and will remain long after we're gone, something that hunts not for food but for sport, for pleasure. They have different names for it, but the description is always the same: tall, thin, patient. It doesn't just kill its victims, it plays with them, makes them see things that can't be real, hear voices that shouldn't exist, and it never ever stops hunting once it's found its prey. I dream about it sometimes. In the dreams, I'm back on that porch with Zeke, but this time I see it clearly, unfolding itself from the darkness, its limbs moving in ways that bones shouldn't allow. It looks at me with eyes that aren't eyes, and I know it remembers me, knows my name, knows that one day I'll come back, because that's the real horror of it all. Part of me wants to go back, to understand, to know for sure what happened to my friend. And sometimes on long nights when I can't sleep, I find myself looking up flights to Miami, calculating the distance to that cabin in the swamp. I won't go, I can't. But the wanting, that's how it gets you. That's how it always gets you, in the end. The rangers eventually sold that cabin to some other unsuspecting tourists. I think about them sometimes, sitting on that porch, fishing in that dark water. I wonder if they notice the smell or the silence that falls at night. I wonder if they see the tracks in the mud or hear that wet purring sound in the darkness. And I wonder if they'll be smarter than we were when it finally comes for them. I've carried this story with me for 14 years now, letting it weigh on my conscience like the heavy pack I used to shoulder through the wilderness. You won't find any news story about what happened in July 2010. No reports, just some dusty file in a backwoods sheriff's office. Hell, my wife barely believed me at first, and she's the most supportive woman on this planet. But I'm here, aren't I? Got the scars to prove it, both the physical ones and the ones you can't see. My name's Doug Miller. I worked search and rescue in Sequoia National Forest for nearly a decade, from 2005 to 2011. Most folks picture rangers sitting in towers watching for smoke trails or helping tourists spot bears from a safe distance. The reality is messier, more complicated. We're the ones who go looking when things go wrong. I was 38 then, married with 2 kids who thought Dad's job was just playing hide-and-seek in the woods. Sometimes they weren't far off. The best days ended with us finding some dazed hiker and getting them back to their family. But nature has teeth, and sometimes it bites. It started on a Tuesday morning in mid-July. The air was thick with that particular summer heaviness that makes even breathing feel like work. I was doing paperwork, there's always paperwork, when the call came in about 2 missing hikers, Mark Chen and Anna Richardson. I remember studying their file, both 29 software engineers from San Francisco. The photos showed them grinning at the camera in matching North Face gear, all clean and new. You see that a lot, people thinking they can buy expertise, that the wilderness will respect a credit card limit. Their itinerary listed previous hikes in Yosemite and the Redwoods. Experienced, they called themselves. But there's experienced, and then there's experienced. They'd planned a 4-day trek along the Mineral King Trail, one of our more challenging routes. It's beautiful country up there, but unforgiving. The elevation changes mess with your head, and the weather can turn mean without warning. When they missed their check-in and their emergency beacon stayed silent, we mobilized. We assembled a 5-person initial search team, me, Ron Dawson, our senior tracker, Keith Martinez, medical specialist, Brenda Walsh, survival expert, and Tim O'Connor, communications. The morning briefing was standard procedure, grid patterns, radio protocols, emergency procedures. But something felt off from the start. Maybe it was the unusually still air, or how the morning birds seemed quieter than normal. The first day was methodical. We spread out in a standard search pattern, checking obvious camping spots and markers. Radio chatter stayed professional. Coordinates, confirmations, the occasional all clear. The Mineral King Valley stretched before us, granite peaks scraping the sky, ancient sequoias standing like silent sentinels. People don't realize how big these trees are until they're standing at the base of one, feeling smaller than they've ever felt before. By the second day, even our most optimistic team members had gone quiet. The forest felt different, heavier somehow. Around mid-afternoon we found their campsite, and everything changed. I've seen bear attacks. I've seen mountain lion kills. This was different. The site looked like it had been hit by some kind of whirlwind, but with purpose. Their tent wasn't just collapsed, it was shredded, the heavy-duty nylon torn like tissue paper. The backpacks were scattered in a 30-foot radius, contents spilling out like colorful autumn leaves. Energy bars, maps, a crushed satellite phone. The blood is what got me. In my line of work, you get used to seeing blood. Animals get hurt, people fall, it happens. But this was different. Dark patches soaked into the earth, splatter patterns up tree trunks that made no sense. The sleeping bags were the worst part. One was missing entirely. The other, I've spent years trying to forget what that sleeping bag looked like. The material hadn't just been torn. It looked like something had erupted from inside it. Ron, who'd been tracking for 20 years and had seen every kind of animal attack imaginable, went pale. I watched him kneel beside a set of marks in the dirt, his weathered hand hovering over them without touching. "Doug," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you ever seen tracks like these?" I hadn't. They were huge, but that wasn't the strange part. The pattern was all wrong, like something had walked through there on too many legs, leaving impressions that seemed to change depth and shape between steps. HQ's response was swift once they saw our initial report. By sunrise the next day, our small search party had grown into something that looked more like a military operation. 24 people minimum, including specialists I'd never seen before. Among them was Dr. Rebecca Winters, a wildlife biologist who'd written papers on predator behavior in the Sierra Nevada range. She took one look at those tracks and started making calls. The new arrivals brought equipment I'd never seen in my years of service: thermal imaging gear, sound detection arrays, even some kind of portable DNA testing kit. But the person who caught my attention was Cal Standing Bear from Fish and Wildlife. He arrived alone, carrying an old Winchester rifle and wearing a jacket that had seen better days. Cal didn't say much during the briefing, just stood at the back, eyes sharp as obsidian. When Dr. Winters finished her technical assessment, he asked exactly one question. Which direction did the blood trail lead? No introduction, no credentials offered, just that question, asked in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of generations. We split into teams of 2. I got paired with Cal, which I later realized wasn't coincidence. He moved through the forest like he was part of it, each step deliberate, silent. Made me, with my decade of experience, feel like a rookie stumbling through their first day. The temperature dropped as we pushed deeper into the old-growth forest. Here the sequoias were ancient, their massive trunks disappearing into the canopy hundreds of feet above. The forest floor was a maze of fallen logs and thick ferns, every step requiring careful consideration. "Your people," Cal said suddenly, breaking hours of silence. "They have stories about these woods." I told him about the usual campfire tales, lost hikers, mysterious lights, the standard stuff you hear at any national park. He just nodded. "My people have older stories, about things that were here before, things that never left." He stopped walking, held up a hand. "You smell that?" I did. Like wet fur and copper pennies with something else underneath. Sharp, chemical, wrong. The birds had gone silent again. Even the ever-present wind in the trees had died. That's when we found the deer carcass, 15 feet up in a young sequoia. No bear or mountain lion puts their kills in trees like that. And the marks on the bones, they weren't teeth marks, at least not from any animal I knew. They looked more like tool marks. We made camp at sunset, but this was no ordinary wilderness bivouac. The specialists set up a perimeter of sensors and lights that would have made a military base proud. Dr. Winters coordinated with her team, setting up monitoring stations and taking samples of everything: soil, bark, even air samples in sealed containers. Cal didn't participate in any of this. He found the biggest sequoia in the area, put his back against it, and began methodically checking his rifle. I noticed he was loading it with custom ammunition, heavy brass shells that gleamed dully in the fading light. The attack came at 2:17 a.m. I know because I was staring at my watch, trying to stay alert during my shift. The first warning was the sensors going dead one by one in a circle around our camp. Not triggered, dead, like something was systematically taking them out. The thing about real predators is that they don't announce themselves. They don't growl or roar or give you any warning. They just appear. But this wanted us to know it was coming. The sound started low, barely audible, a vibration more than a noise, something you felt in your chest before your ears caught it. Then it grew, becoming a growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, the kind of sound that bypasses your rational mind and goes straight to the primitive hindbrain, triggering instincts buried under millions of years of evolution. Dr. Winters' thermal cameras picked it up first, a heat signature that made no sense. It seemed to shift and split, like looking at something through a broken lens. One moment it showed as a massive single form, the next it appeared to be several smaller shapes moving in perfect synchronization. The rookie, God, I can't even remember his name now, he was the first to break. Can't blame him. Training prepares you for bears, for mountain lions, for lost hikers and bad weather. Nothing prepares you for something that moves like a shadow with mass, that seems to bend the light around it. He ran. That was his mistake. Cal's voice cut through the chaos. Don't run. It wants you to run. But it was too late. The rookie's flashlight beam bounced crazily through the trees as he fled. Then came the scream. I've heard death screams before. Animals, people, death has a sound. This was different. This was the sound of someone seeing something their mind couldn't process in their final moments. The next few minutes were chaos. Gunshots, shouts, equipment crashing. That thing moved through our camp like a wind through grass, impossible to track or target. Cal's rifle boomed twice, just twice, each shot followed by a shriek that couldn't have come from anything natural. Then silence, the kind of silence that feels like a physical weight. Dawn revealed the carnage. Our camp was destroyed, equipment scattered and crushed. Blood trails led in multiple directions, but they all ended abruptly, as if whatever made them had simply vanished into thin air. Cal found what was left of the rookie. He didn't let anyone else see the body, just wrapped it in a tarp and called for immediate evacuation. Before the helicopters arrived, he pulled me aside. Some things, he said, aren't meant to be understood. Your people, they'll want answers, reports, evidence. They won't find any. He pressed something into my hand, a small leather pouch on a cord. Wear this. It won't stop them, but they'll smell it. Stay away. The official investigation found nothing conclusive. The tracks disappeared into solid rock. The blood samples were contaminated. The thermal footage was corrupted. Dr. Winter's preliminary report mentioned unknown environmental factors and inconclusive evidence before she was reassigned to a desk job in Sacramento. I quit search and rescue the following year, moved to Idaho, took a job managing a sporting goods store. My wife never asked about the leather pouch I still wear, or why I check the locks 3 times every night. But sometimes when the wind blows just right and the shadows grow long, I think about those marks on the bones. Tool marks. Intelligence. Purpose. I think about Cal's words about old stories and things that never left. The forest holds secrets, ancient secrets, and sometimes when we venture too deep, we discover that we were never really at the top of the food chain. We just forgot what it was like to be prey. Mark Chen and Anna Richardson were never found. They're listed as missing, presumed dead by misadventure. Just 2 more names in the long list of people who went into the wilderness and never came out. I still have nightmares about that sound, that impossible growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But what really keeps me awake at night is the thought that it's still out there, waiting, watching, and sometimes when I see news reports about missing hikers in national parks, I wonder if they heard that sound too in their final moments. Cal was right about one thing. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some predators aren't meant to be understood. And sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away and try to forget what you've seen. But you never really forget. You just learn to live with the knowing. I've spent 23 years working in national parks, and what happened on July 4, 2011, is the reason I'll never step foot in Olympic National Forest again. The memory is seared into my mind like a brand, every detail, every sound, every shadow that moved when it shouldn't have. Most people think of the Pacific Northwest forests as peaceful places. Tourist photos show sunlight filtering through towering evergreens, casting dappled patterns on beds of moss. They capture the mist hanging between branches like gossamer curtains, the vibrant green ferns unfurling beneath century-old trees. But they don't show what lurks in the spaces between those trees, in the depths where even midday sun can't penetrate. I'd been a ranger there for 8 years by then, started when I was 24, fresh out of college with a degree in environmental science and head full of idealistic notions about preserving nature. The solitude suited me. I'd always been the quiet type, more comfortable with field guides than people. My colleagues used to joke that I was part tree myself, the way I could stand still for hours, just watching the forest breathe. The summer of 2011 had been unusual from the start. Spring came late that year, and when it finally arrived, it brought heavy rains that lasted well into June. The moisture made everything grow with almost unnatural vigor. Moss spread thick across fallen logs, mushrooms sprouted overnight in vast clusters, and the understory became so dense you could barely see 10 feet off the trail in some places. We'd been getting strange reports too. More than the usual missing hiker calls or bear sightings. Campers described feeling watched. Experienced hikers swore they heard footsteps following them, only to turn and find nothing there. One woman, a geology professor who'd been studying the area's rock formations for decades, reported seeing something wrong moving through the trees at dusk. When pressed for details, she just shook her head and said it moved in a way nothing should move. I didn't put much stock in these stories at first. The forest plays tricks on people's minds, especially as daylight fades. But looking back, I should have seen the pattern, should have noticed how the wildlife had changed. Fewer deer sightings, unusual quiet in areas that should have been teeming with birdsong. Even the ravens, usually so bold, had grown scarce. July 4th started like any other shift. The holiday meant most of my colleagues were off duty, celebrating with family or friends. I volunteered to work, partly because I had no plans, but mostly because I loved the forest when it was quiet. Tourist traffic would be light, concentrated mainly around the easily accessible viewpoints and picnic areas. The serious hikers, the ones who ventured deeper into the backcountry, usually avoided holiday weekends. The morning passed uneventfully. I checked the usual trouble spots, places where people like to leave trash or try to camp illegally. Made note of a few trail sections that needed maintenance. The air was thick with humidity, and despite the cloud cover, sweat soaked through my uniform shirt by noon. Around mid-afternoon, I got my first hint that something was off. I found fresh scratch marks on a cedar tree about 8 feet up the trunk, too high for a black bear, too deep for a cougar. The bark had been torn away in long strips, revealing pale wood underneath. The exposed sap gleamed like blood in the filtered light. I photographed the marks and took measurements, telling myself it was probably just a brown bear passing through, though we rarely saw them in this part of the forest. Still, something about those marks nagged at me. They seemed deliberate somehow, like a message left in a language I couldn't quite read. The radio at my hip crackled to life at 4:47 p.m. I remember the time exactly because I'd just checked my watch, thinking about ending my patrol early. The voice that came through was high-pitched with panic, fighting against static interference. "Anyone there? Please. Partner missing. Trail Junction 23, won't answer calls." I pressed the talk button, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. "This is Ranger Morrison. Please repeat your location and situation." The response came in broken bursts, but I pieced together enough. A woman named Anya, claiming her hiking partner Rowan had vanished. They'd been on one of the less-traveled trails, the kind that doesn't show up on tourist maps. She said he'd been gone for almost an hour. Something in her voice set off warning bells in my mind. This wasn't the usual lost hiker scenario. There was raw terror there, the kind that comes from seeing something your brain refuses to process. I told her to stay put, that I'd meet her at the trailhead. As I drove my truck along the winding forest road, the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Long shadows stretched across the pavement like grasping fingers, and for the first time in years, I felt that old childhood fear of the dark starting to creep back in. I didn't know it then, but I was driving toward something that would shatter my understanding of the natural world. Something that would prove that sometimes the monsters we imagine lurking in the shadows are real and far worse than anything our nightmares can conjure. I found Anya exactly where she said she'd be, at the small gravel parking area marking the trailhead. She was a tall woman, maybe in her mid-30s, dressed in proper hiking gear, moisture-wicking clothes, sturdy boots, a high-end backpack. Not some unprepared tourist who'd wandered off the marked path. This detail only added to my unease. Her face was pale, making the dark circles under her eyes stand out like bruises. She started talking before I'd even fully stepped out of the truck, words tumbling out in a rushed stream. "We were just hiking, everything was normal, but then we had this stupid argument. God, it was so stupid. About which trail fork to take. Rowan wanted to check out this overlook he'd read about, but it wasn't on any of our maps. I told him we should stick to the marked trails, but you know how some people get." She ran her hands through her hair, which had mostly escaped its ponytail. "He went ahead anyway, said he'd be right back. That was hours ago." I pulled out my notebook, trying to get the essential details. "Can you describe Rowan? What was he wearing?" 6 foot tall, athletic build, short brown hair. He had on a blue moisture-wicking shirt, khaki hiking pants, and a black day pack with red straps. "He's experienced, we both are. We do this kind of thing all the time. He wouldn't..." Her voice cracked, and I saw tears welling up in her eyes. I've dealt with plenty of missing person reports over the years, but something about this one felt different. Anya wasn't just worried. She was terrified. "Did you notice anything unusual before he disappeared? Any wildlife activity, strange sounds, anything out of the ordinary?" She hesitated, and I saw something flicker across her face. Recognition maybe, or relief that someone was finally asking the right questions. "The birds," she said quietly. "Everything got quiet right before. You know how the forest usually has this background noise? Birds, insects, wind in the trees. It all just stopped, like someone had hit a mute button, and there was this smell, What kind of smell? Like rot, but not normal forest decay, something deeper, older, like opening a tomb that's been sealed for centuries. She wrapped her arms around herself, though the evening wasn't particularly cold. I thought I was imagining things at first, but then I heard. She trailed off, shaking her head. You'll think I'm crazy. Try me, I said, thinking about those scratch marks I'd found earlier. It sounded like someone walking, but wrong, like the feet were, I don't know, like they were being dragged almost. And there was this clicking sound like someone tapping long nails on wood, but it seemed to come from too high up. My mouth went dry. The description matched some of the other reports we'd been getting, the ones that never made it into official records because they sounded too fantastic, too impossible. The sun was setting fast now, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and crimson. Soon it would be full dark, and while I had powerful flashlights in my truck, something told me we didn't want to be out here after nightfall. But I couldn't just leave someone out there. Show me where you last saw him, I said, grabbing my gear. We'll do one sweep of the immediate area, but if we don't find anything, we'll need to call in a proper search team. Anya nodded, but her eyes kept darting to the tree line, as if expecting something to emerge from the deepening shadows. As we started up the trail, I radioed in our position and situation. The response was garbled, unusual for this area despite the terrain. I could barely make out the dispatcher saying something about sending backup, but the static was so bad I couldn't get confirmation. The forest felt different as we walked. I'd been on this trail hundreds of times, knew every bend and switchback, but tonight it seemed alien. The familiar landmarks took on sinister aspects in the fading light. Branches reached out like gnarled hands, and the moss hanging from the trees resembled tattered shrouds. About a mile in, Anya stopped suddenly. This is where we split up. He went that way. She pointed to a barely visible game trail branching off the main path. I swept my flashlight beam along the narrow track. The vegetation was thick here, ferns and salal bushes crowding the edges. Something had passed through recently. The plants were bent and broken in places, but the marks were odd. Not the clean breaks you'd expect from someone pushing through undergrowth, but twisted, almost shredded in places. "Rowan," I called out, my voice seeming to dead end against the dense foliage. "This is Forest Service. Can you hear me?" Only silence answered, but it was an active silence, the kind that feels like it's listening back. We pressed on, moving slower now as the trail grew less distinct. I was about to suggest we turn back, when my light caught something that made my heart skip. A black daypack with red straps, lying half-hidden under a fallen log. Anya's sharp intake of breath confirmed it was Rowan's. I held up a hand, signaling her to stay back, while I approached the pack carefully. Years of training kicked in as I scanned the area for signs of struggle, animal tracks, anything that might tell us what happened. The pack was intact, no signs of animal damage. It lay at an odd angle, though, as if it had been placed rather than dropped. I crouched down to examine it closer, and that's when I caught the smell Anya had described earlier. A deep, primitive stench that seemed to bypass my nose and hit some ancient part of my brain, triggering every survival instinct I possessed. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond our light's reach. I froze, every muscle tensing. Another sound followed, a soft shuffling, like something heavy being dragged through dead leaves. Then came the clicking, just as Anya had described, but now I could tell it wasn't nails on wood. It was more like bone striking bone, a sound no natural creature should make. "Don't move," I whispered to Anya, though she was already statue still beside me. The shuffling grew closer. I slowly raised my flashlight, dreading what its beam might reveal. For a moment, nothing. Then, movement. Something pale flashed between the trees, something tall and wrong. My light caught it for just a split second, but that glimpse was enough to turn my blood to ice. It stood at least 9 feet tall, its body a twisted parody of human form. The skin was a sickly white, stretched too tight over an impossibly thin frame. Arms hung nearly to the ground, ending in hands that bore long black claws. But it was the head that haunted me, too small for the body, hairless, with eyes that reflected my light like pools of amber glass. Anya made a small, choked sound beside me. The creature's head snapped toward us with horrible speed, and those eyes... God, those eyes focused on us with an intelligence that was unmistakably predatory. "Run," I breathed, slowly at first. Then when I say now, sprint for the main trail. We began backing away, my light never leaving those reflecting eyes. The creature matched our pace, staying just at the edge of the darkness. It moved with an unnatural grace, its 2 long limbs allowing it to navigate the dense underbrush without a sound. 20 feet from the main trail, it made its move. One moment it was keeping its distance, the next it was surging forward with impossible speed. "Now!" I screamed, and we ran. What followed was the most terrifying few minutes of my life. We crashed through the forest, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear it behind us, not breathing hard like we were, but making that awful clicking sound, always just a few steps behind. Twice more I caught glimpses of it, moving parallel to our course through gaps in the trees. It was toying with us, I realized. It could have caught us at any time, but it was drawing out the chase, feeding on our fear. The parking lot lights appeared ahead, seeming impossibly far away. My lungs were burning, and Anya was starting to stumble beside me. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the presence behind us vanished. The clicking stopped, the shuffling ceased, and we were alone in our panicked flight. We burst out of the tree line and collapsed on the asphalt, gasping for air. Other rangers arrived minutes later, drawn by the commotion in my earlier radio call. They found us there, wild-eyed and babbling about what we'd seen. The official search for Rowan lasted 3 days. They brought in dogs, helicopters with thermal imaging, expert trackers. Nothing. No body, no blood trail, no sign of what happened to him. Just that abandoned backpack, which seemed unnaturally clean when they recovered it, as if something had carefully removed any traces that might tell us more. The official report listed it as a probable animal attack, with the victim's body presumably dragged off by a predator. They suggested a bear or mountain lion, though neither explanation accounted for the lack of physical evidence. Some suggested Rowan had simply gotten lost and succumbed to exposure, though the weather had been mild and he was well equipped. Anya and I knew better, but who would believe us? I tried describing what we'd seen, but the words felt inadequate, like trying to describe a color that doesn't exist. The other rangers were sympathetic but skeptical. They suggested stress, poor lighting, and fear had played tricks on our minds. I submitted my transfer request the next day, took a position managing equipment logistics for the Forest Service, safely behind a desk in Portland. Some called it running away. Maybe it was, but I'd seen something that didn't fit into my understanding of the natural world, and I couldn't go back to patrolling those trails knowing what lurked in the deeper shadows. Anya and I kept in touch for a while. She moved to Arizona, about as far from dense forests as she could get. Last I heard, she was leading rock climbing tours in the desert. Sometimes we'd talk late at night, comparing notes about what we'd seen, trying to make sense of it. She'd done research, found similar stories from other forests around the world, tales of impossibly tall, pale creatures that hunted alone hikers. Some accounts dated back centuries. That was 12 years ago. I still wake up some nights, drenched in sweat, those amber eyes burning in my memory. The smell of rot seems to linger in my nostrils, and the clicking sound echoes in my ears. I've learned to live with it, mostly. Learned to avoid forests, to stay in well-lit places surrounded by the noise and energy of the city. But I know it's still out there. Every few months I read about another disappearance in the Olympic forest. Most are explained away, exposure, animals, accidents. But sometimes I recognize the details, the strange silence before someone vanishes, the unexplained sounds, the feeling of being watched by something ancient and hungry. I wonder about Rowan sometimes. Was he taken quickly, or did that thing chase him through the darkening forest like it chased us? Did he see those eyes, understand what was happening to him? Part of me hopes it was fast, that he never knew what found him out there on that forgotten trail. The Forest Service has my report somewhere in their files, filed away with all the other incidents they can't or won't explain. But I know what I saw that day, what Anya saw. There are things in this world that defy our comfortable categorizations of natural and unnatural, things that have existed in the dark spaces longer than we've been here to fear them. Sometimes, late at night, I look out my apartment window toward the distant tree line of Forest Park. Even here in Portland, miles from the Olympic forest, I catch myself searching the shadows for movement, for that too tall silhouette with its impossibly long arms. The city lights help. They push back the darkness, create a barrier between our world of concrete and steel and that older, wilder place where such things dwell. Last month, I received an email from one of my old colleagues still working at Olympic. She'd found something while digitizing old ranger logs from the 1950s. Reports of a similar creature described with terrifying consistency: the pale, stretched skin, the small, wrong-shaped head, those amber eyes that reflected light like mirrors. The report stopped abruptly after several hikers vanished without trace. The area was closed for a few months, then reopened with no explanation. The thing is, that section of forest? It's less than 5 miles from where Rowan disappeared. I've started gathering other accounts, careful to avoid the more sensational stories that populate paranormal websites. Instead, I focus on official reports, ranger logs, and first-hand accounts from experienced outdoors people who know the difference between a bear and something else. The pattern is always the same: periods of heightened activity followed by disappearances, then silence for years or decades before the cycle begins again. 3 weeks ago, I got a call from Anya. She was back in Washington, having finally found the courage to return. She'd been doing her own research, connecting with other witnesses, building a case. "It's territorial," she told me, her voice tight with suppressed excitement. "It has a hunting ground, a pattern. We could find it. Stop it." I cut her off before she could finish. "Don't," I warned her. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. Some things should be left alone." She was quiet for a long moment. "Rowan deserves justice," she said finally. "Rowan deserves peace," I countered. "And you won't find either of those things out there in those woods." She hung up. I haven't heard from her since. I check the news every morning, dreading the day I'll see another missing person report from Olympic National Forest. I tell myself I should do something, warn people, share what I know. But who would believe me? And even if they did, what good would it do? You can't close an entire forest. You can't stop people from venturing into the wilderness, seeking that solitude that draws us all to wild places. So I do the only thing I can. I share my story, hoping it might save someone else. If you're reading this, take it as a warning. The forests of this world are ancient places, and not all their secrets are benign. There are things out there that defy explanation, predators that have adapted to hunt us in ways we can barely comprehend. If you go hiking, stick to marked trails. Don't go alone. And if you're ever deep in the woods and everything goes quiet, not just quiet but silent in that complete unnatural way, don't wait. Don't try to be rational about it. Just get out. Run. Run as fast as you can towards sunlight and civilization. Because sometimes that prickle on the back of your neck isn't just your imagination. Sometimes that shadow moving just beyond your flashlight beam isn't just a trick of light and leaves. Sometimes the monster watching you from the darkness is real, and if you ever find yourself in the Olympic National Forest and you hear a strange clicking sound, like bone against bone, coming from somewhere above you, don't look up. Don't try to see what's making it, just run. Run and pray it isn't hungry that day. As for me, I've made my peace with never going back to the forest. I've learned to live with the nightmares, the lingering questions, the guilt over Rowan. But some nights when the wind blows just right and carries the scent of pine and moss from the distant trees, I swear I can smell that other scent underneath, that ancient rotting smell. And I know with a certainty that chills me to my core that somewhere out there in the darkness, it's still hunting. The city lights still burn bright outside my window, holding back the night. But somewhere in the deep woods of Olympic National Forest, something moves between the trees, its amber eyes reflecting starlight, waiting for the next unwary soul to wander too far from the trail. And the clicking sound echoes through the darkness, a sound like bone striking bone, calling out to those who would dare to venture into its domain. The first signs of spring were deceptive in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Sure, the calendar said April, but up here winter's grip loosened slowly, reluctantly, like a predator forced to release its prey. I was 28, leading my first major research project, tracking wolf populations, and desperately trying to prove I deserved the position. My name's Rylan Mitchell, and I've spent the last 3 years monitoring a particular pack of gray wolves in the remote forests near the Canadian border. The work is demanding, long days of trudging through melting snow and marshland, collecting data, and hoping to catch glimpses of our elusive subjects. But it's what I signed up for when I took this position with the Department of Natural Resources. That spring, we were tracking what we believed to be a pregnant female. Finding her den would be crucial for our population studies and understanding pack dynamics in the region. I had 2 graduate interns working with me, Jimena Vasquez, a sharp-minded ecology student from Arizona State, and Dion Washington, a former park ranger turned wildlife biology major. Jimena was meticulous, careful, the kind of researcher who triple-checked her equipment before heading out. Dion brought experience from his ranger days. He knew how to read terrain, track animals, and most importantly, how to stay safe in the wilderness. Together, they made an excellent team, though their constant bickering sometimes made me feel more like a babysitter than a lead researcher. The morning started like any other field day. We met at the research station at dawn, going through our pre-expedition checklist: GPS units, radio transmitters, sample collection kits, emergency supplies, the usual drill. But something felt off from the start. Maybe it was the unusual warmth for early spring or the way the morning mist clung to the ground longer than it should have. Weather report says we might get rain later, Jimena said, double-checking the waterproof covers on her equipment. She always came prepared, even for unlikely scenarios. Dion snorted, adjusting his pack. Rain's the least of our worries. Have you seen the mosquitoes up here? They're like tiny vampires with wings. I smiled at their familiar dynamic while recording our departure time in the logbook. Focus, people. We've got a pregnant wolf to track, and these signals suggest she's moving into new territory. The first few hours were routine, following tracking signals, recording GPS coordinates, collecting scat samples when we found them. The terrain was challenging, especially with the spring thaw turning everything into a soggy mess. Ancient glaciers had carved this landscape into a maze of small hills and valleys, creating countless hidden spots where a wolf might den. Around midday, we noticed the first unusual signs. The forest had grown quieter, the usual spring chorus of birds notably absent. Even the insects seemed subdued. As a wildlife biologist, you learn to read these signals. When the forest goes quiet, it usually means something's wrong. Rylan, Dion called out softly, crouching near a fallen log. Take a look at this. I made my way over, careful to avoid the deeper patches of mud. What he'd found wasn't typical wolf sign. The marks in the soft earth were too large, the spacing irregular. The impressions suggested something bipedal but not human, and definitely not bear. What do you make of this? He asked, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. I studied the tracks, trying to match them against my mental catalog of local wildlife. Nothing fit. Could be partially melted, I suggested, more to reassure myself than anything else. Water can distort tracks pretty significantly. Jimena had joined us, her camera already out. These are fresh, she said quietly, placing her hand near one for scale as she photographed it. The edges are still sharp, and look, there's water seeping into the impressions. These can't be more than an hour old. She was right, of course. The tracks were fresh, and they were wrong. Everything about them was wrong. The stride length suggested something tall, but the depth of the impressions pointed to something impossibly heavy for its size. And then there was the shape, a sort of elongated oval with what looked like claw marks at one end, but not matching any predator native to Michigan. The GPS signal led us deeper into the forest, into an area where the trees grew so dense their branches interlocked overhead, creating a permanent twilight even at midday. The ground had changed too, less marsh now, more moss-covered rocks and fallen trees. Perfect wolf-denning territory under normal circumstances. Signal strongest just ahead, I whispered, more out of instinct than necessity. Something about the place demanded silence. That's when we heard it, a sound that didn't belong in these woods. A low, rhythmic thumping, like a massive heart beating just below the forest floor. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the trees. Dion reached for his bear spray, a reflexive gesture that somehow made the situation more unsettling. What were we expecting to face that would make bear spray seem like a reasonable defense? The clearing appeared suddenly, as if the forest had drawn back its curtain just for us. A small dark pond lay at its center, its surface unnaturally still despite the spring breeze. And there, at the water's edge, was something that shouldn't exist. It happened so fast. The thing by the pond was massive, easily 8 feet tall when it reared up. Its movements were wrong, like watching a stop-motion film with missing frames. The fur wasn't fur at all up close. It was more like thick, matted filaments that seemed to writhe independently of the creature's movement. Those eyes. God, those eyes. They weren't just yellow. They were phosphorescent, like someone had planted LED lights behind them. But it was the intelligence in them that haunted me. Not animal intelligence, but something else. Something that knew exactly what it was doing. "Back away slowly," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. No sudden movements. We were doing everything right. Everything they teach you about predator encounters. But this wasn't a predator, not in any conventional sense. This was something else entirely. The attack came from behind. There must have been 2 of them. Had to have been, because while we were focused on the one by the pond, another struck from the dense undergrowth behind us. Jimena's scream cut through the air like a knife, then stopped with a wet, horrible sound that I'll never forget. "Jimena!" Dion's voice cracked as he spun around, bear spray already raised. I turned just in time to see her disappear into the shadows. Not dragged. It was too fast for that. More like she was simply erased. One moment there, the next gone, with only a few scraps of her red research jacket caught on a branch, dripping dark onto the forest floor. What followed was a nightmare of crashing through undergrowth, splitting our eardrums with the shrill beep of emergency whistles, and trying not to think about what had just happened. Dion and I ran. There's no shame in admitting it, we ran like hell. And the forest seemed to have transformed around us. Every shadow held potential death. Every rustle of leaves sent spikes of adrenaline through our systems. The GPS unit was useless. The screen showed only static, though I didn't realize until later that all our electronic equipment had malfunctioned at the same moment. "We have to go back," Dion gasped as we paused, backs pressed against a massive oak. "We can't just leave her. She's gone." I cut him off, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "You saw what happened. We go back, we die. Simple as that." He knew I was right. We both knew. But knowing didn't make it any easier. The trek back to the research station was the longest 2 hours of my life. Every step felt like we were being watched. That rhythmic thumping seemed to follow us, always just at the edge of hearing, like a nightmare you can't quite shake off upon waking. The official investigation was a joke. How could it be anything else? Search and rescue combed the area for 3 days. They found nothing. No blood, no tracks, no sign of Jimena or whatever had taken her. Even the pond we'd seen was gone, replaced by a patch of marshy ground that looked like it had been there for decades. "Probable bear attack," the report said. They even had a theory about how the bear might have dragged her into an underground den or cavity. It was neater that way, simpler. But Dion and I knew better. The scientific community was worse. I submitted detailed reports, complete with sketches and measurements taken from memory. They were politely dismissed. A few colleagues suggested stress-induced hallucination. Others hinted at shared delusion. My research funding was quietly redirected to more promising projects. Dion quit. Last I heard, he'd moved to Arizona, about as far from northern forests as he could get while staying in the continental U.S. Can't say I blame him. That was 3 years ago. I'm still in the field, still doing research, but not in Michigan. I transferred to a project studying urban coyote populations in Chicago. Safer, more concrete, less forest. No unexplained shadows. But something changed in me that day. The way I see the world, the way I understand nature. It's different now. There's a reason our ancestors feared the dark, feared the deep woods. They knew something we've forgotten. I still do field research, but never alone, and never without multiple backup plans. I've installed every tracking app available on my phone, carry 3 different emergency beacons, and never go anywhere without a satellite phone. My colleagues think I'm paranoid. They're probably right. Here's what I believe happened, though I've never put this in an official report. Whatever we encountered that day wasn't a cryptid or an undiscovered species. It was something that had always been there, hiding in the spaces between what we think we know about the natural world. The Upper Peninsula's forests are ancient. The glaciers that carved them left behind more than just lakes and moraines. They left pockets, spaces where reality gets thin. Most of the time these places stay hidden, but sometimes when the conditions are just right, when spring thaw releases what winter has bound, when the boundary between water and land blurs, something slips through. I've done my research since then. There are other stories if you know where to look. Hunters who've gone missing without a trace. Hikers who've returned with impossible tales. Even other researchers, though they're usually more careful about what they put in their reports. The scientific method is based on observation, documentation, and repeatability. But what do you do when the thing you've observed defies documentation? When the evidence vanishes like morning mist? When attempting to repeat the observation might get you killed? I still have the GPS unit from that day. It never worked again, but sometimes, late at night, its blank screen flickers with strange patterns. And if you listen carefully, you might hear something like a heartbeat coming from its dead circuits. A rhythmic thumping, slow and steady, like something huge moving through the deep woods, waiting for its next opportunity. I received a package last week. No return address, postmarked from a small town in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Inside was a single photograph, smudged and water-damaged. It showed a clearing in the woods, and at its center, a dark pond. The image was blurry, probably taken with a shaking hand, but at the water's edge. I burned the photograph. Some things are better left undocumented. Some truths are better left untold. But I know they're still out there, in the deep woods where the shadows grow thick and the boundary between what we know and what we fear becomes dangerously thin. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear that rhythmic thumping, calling me back to the woods. But I won't go. Some questions aren't meant to be answered. Some research should remain incomplete. Remember Ximena. Remember what the deep woods hide. And if you're ever in the forests of northern Michigan and you hear something like a heartbeat coming from the shadows, run, run, and don't look back. My name's Deputy Ben Walker. These days, most folks around here just call me the crazy old man with the shotgun, but I earned my badge honestly, serving the Whisper Falls Sheriff's Department for 15 years before everything went sideways. Back then, I was 32, divorced, and convinced I had life figured out. Funny how wrong a man can be. Whisper Falls, Colorado isn't the kind of place you find by accident. Nestled deep in the Rockies, population barely breaking 2,000 during ski season, we're the definition of a backwater town. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where the biggest excitement used to be catching teenagers drinking at the old quarry or breaking up the occasional bar fight at the Rusty Pike. I remember exactly how it started. The weather that spring had been unusually wet, turning the mountain trails into treacherous mudslides. When the Reeves couple from Denver went missing off Trail 23, nobody thought much of it. Tourists get lost all the time, take a wrong turn, ignore the warning signs. Search and rescue found their backpack caught on a branch near Widow's Creek, their rental car still parked at the trailhead. No bodies, though. That should have been our first clue. A week later, the Johnsons disappeared. Now that was different. Frank and Martha Johnson weren't tourists. They'd lived here since before I was born. Every morning, like clockwork, they'd walk their ancient golden retriever up to the ski resort and back. The dog came home alone that Tuesday, whining and covered in mud. We found their walking sticks snapped in half about a mile up the trail. The town started talking then. Whispers about mountain lions, maybe a rogue bear. But I'd worked these mountains long enough to know predator signs. There were no tracks, no blood, no torn clothing. Just people vanishing into thin air, leaving behind nothing but questions and a growing sense of unease. I was working late that Friday night, catching up on paperwork from the Johnson case. The station was quiet, just me and the gentle hum of the ancient coffee maker in the break room. Sheriff Mills had gone home hours ago, leaving me to lock up. It was 0:32 when I heard the first noise. At first I thought it was just another raccoon in the dumpsters. We'd been having trouble with them all summer, clever little bastards figuring out how to pop the lids. I grabbed my flashlight, not even bothering with my gun. 15 years on the force, and I'd never needed to draw it outside the shooting range. Another mistake. The alley behind the station was narrow, barely wide enough for our patrol cars to squeeze through. A single bulb flickered above the back door, casting weird shadows across the crumbling brick walls. The smell hit me first, like meat left too long in the sun, mixed with something chemical and wrong. My nose wrinkled as I swept the flashlight beam across the dumpsters. That's when I saw it. You know how your mind sometimes refuses to process what your eyes are seeing, like there's a disconnect between reality and what you're willing to accept as possible. For a solid 10 seconds I stood there trying to make sense of the shape huddled between the dumpsters. It looked almost like a pile of old clothes at first, or maybe a large dog curled up in the shadows. Then it moved. I've seen my share of horror movies, always thought I knew how I'd react in a situation like that. But when that thing unfolded itself, rising up and up and up until it towered over me, all my training, all my experience, it all went right out the window. The creature was impossibly tall, easily 7 feet if it was an inch, with limbs like pale tree branches, too long and too thin to be human. Its skin hung loose on its frame, wrinkled and wet-looking in the dim light. But the head, Jesus, the head! It was massive, swollen like some grotesque balloon, hairless and misshapen. 2 enormous eyes reflected my flashlight beam, bloodshot and intelligent in a way that made my skin crawl. Below them was a mouth that split the thing's face almost in half, filled with row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. It made a sound then, a wet, bubbling hiss that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside its twisted body. I stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the ground. The beam spun wildly, catching glimpses of that horrible face, those hungry eyes. My hand went to my hip, searching for my gun, but found only an empty holster. With stunning clarity, I remembered leaving it on my desk, next to the half-finished report about the Johnsons. The creature moved like nothing I'd ever seen before, dropping to all fours and scuttling towards me with an almost mechanical precision. Its joints bent in ways that shouldn't be possible, long fingers clicking against the pavement like tap shoes from hell. I ran. I'd like to say I made a tactical retreat, that my training kicked in and I executed some kind of professional response to the situation. But the truth is, I ran like a scared kid, pure adrenaline carrying me out of that alley and onto Main Street. My lungs were on fire, heart hammering so hard I could hear it over my own ragged breathing. The streets weren't empty, thank God for small mercies. A group of tourists was stumbling out of the Rusty Pike, laughing and loud in that particular way of people who've had a few too many. I tried to warn them, my voice cracking as I waved frantically at the alley. Help, there's something. The words died in my throat as the creature emerged from the darkness. It moved like a spider, those impossible limbs carrying it faster than anything its size had any right to move. The tourists' laughter turned to screams as it launched itself forward, that massive head swaying on its thin neck like some obscene pendulum. The group scattered, but one woman wasn't fast enough. She tripped on the uneven sidewalk, her high heels betraying her at the worst possible moment. The creature was on her in an instant, those spindly arms wrapping around her body like a twisted straitjacket. I saw her face in the streetlight, young, probably mid-20s, absolute terror etched into every feature as that gaping maw descended towards her. The gunshot caught us all by surprise. The creature reeled back, a shriek like tearing metal splitting the night air. I looked up to see Old Man Harris standing on his second-floor balcony above the pharmacy, rifle raised and smoking in the dim light. Harris had been the town pharmacist for longer than I'd been alive, a quiet man who mostly kept to himself. Now he stood like an avenging angel, chambering another round with practiced ease. The creature seemed to hesitate, its huge head swiveling between Harris and its fallen prey. Then, with a movement almost too fast to follow, it grabbed the woman in its jaws. Her scream cut off abruptly as those teeth closed around her, and then she was gone, just gone, swallowed whole like a snake taking down its prey. The monster turned and fled back towards the alley, moving with that same impossible speed. Another shot rang out from Harris's balcony, and the creature screamed again, but didn't slow down. In seconds, it had vanished into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but the echo of its shriek and the lingering smell of rotting meat. I found myself standing beneath Harris's balcony, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stay upright. The other tourists had gathered in a tight knot nearby, their faces pale and shocked in the streetlight. Nobody spoke. What could you say after seeing something like that? Finally, someone whispered, "What the hell was that?" The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with implications none of us wanted to face. Harris's voice came down from above, rough and commanding. "You get back inside, boy. Gonna be a long night." I should have listened, should have run back to the station, called for backup, done anything except what I did next. But something in me had snapped. Maybe it was the woman's final scream, or maybe it was 15 years of routine suddenly shattered by something impossible. Whatever the reason, I couldn't make myself move. Harris must have seen something in my face, some reflection of the stubborn determination I was feeling. He grunted, "Get up here then. Help me keep watch." The tourists fled back to their hotel rooms where they could pretend what they'd seen was just a bad dream brought on by too much alcohol. I made my way up the narrow stairs to Harris's apartment above the pharmacy, my legs still shaking with each step. The place smelled like medicine and old wood, with a hint of something else, gun oil and whiskey. Harris didn't waste time with pleasantries. He handed me a steaming mug that definitely wasn't coffee, then gestured to a chair on the balcony. We sat in silence, rifles across our laps, watching the street below. The night seemed darker now, the shadows deeper and more threatening. "Been seeing them before," Harris said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Years ago. They come in cycles, thin spots in the world letting them through." "Thin spots?" The whiskey burned in my throat, but it helped steady my hands. He nodded slowly, eyes never leaving the street below. "Places where the veil between worlds wears out. My granddaddy fought 'em in 42. I was just a kid then, saw them snatch folks right out of their homes." "Why Whisper Falls?" It seemed like a stupid question, but I needed something to make sense in this suddenly insane world. Harris took another sip from his mug. "Used to be a mine back in the day. Old-timers talked about weird stuff being dug up, accidents happening. Always figured it was just ghost stories." He paused, his weathered face tight with memory. "Maybe not." The rest of that night stretched on forever. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound made us tense. Those eyes haunted me, those huge, intelligent, hungry eyes. We fired off warning shots whenever we caught glimpses of movement in the darkness, but the creature was patient. It would wait us out, wait for a moment of weakness. Morning came eventually, bringing with it Sheriff Mills and half the county's emergency response team. They found what was left of the tourist woman up near the ski resort. Wasn't much to find. The official report called it a bear attack, a tragic accident. People wanted to believe that explanation. Hell, part of me wanted to believe it too. But I'd seen those eyes. I'd heard that wet, bubbling hiss. And Harris, he'd seen too much in his long life to pretend it was anything other than what it was. The world had changed for us. Or maybe we'd just finally seen it for what it really was. The aftermath was almost worse than the encounter itself. Nobody wanted to talk about what happened. Sheriff Mills put me on administrative leave, said I was suffering from severe shock. Maybe I was. The nightmare started then. Dreams of that twisted body, that massive head, those rows of needle teeth. Harris became my anchor in those early days. We formed an unlikely partnership, the old pharmacist and the suspended deputy. We set up a watch schedule, taking turns patrolling the town, especially around the old quarry where the mine entrance used to be. We knew more creatures would come, drawn by whatever thin spot or portal existed in our little corner of Colorado. The town didn't take kindly to our vigilance. Whispers started circulating. Harris was a senile old man. I was a traumatized cop who'd finally cracked under pressure. Sheriff Mills called me into his office one morning, said he was sorry, but he had to let me go. The badge I'd worn for 15 years suddenly meant nothing. But it didn't matter. I had a new job now, one that didn't come with a pension or health benefits, but felt more important than anything I'd done before. Harris taught me everything he knew about the creatures, how they moved, how they thought, how to spot the signs before they attacked. We lost more people over the years. The creatures were clever, patient. They'd watch and wait, sometimes for weeks before striking. But we got better at fighting them too. Harris had this theory that they couldn't stand certain frequencies, high-pitched sounds that made them retreat back into whatever hell they'd crawled out of. 10 years have passed since that first night in the alley. Harris is gone now, passed away in his sleep 2 winters ago. His old rifle hangs above my fireplace next to my own collection of weapons. The town keeps getting smaller. Folks move away to the city looking for places where monsters are just things in movies and books. But I stay. Somebody has to. Whisper Falls isn't the sleepy little mountain town it used to be. These days we get a different kind of tourism, the kind that comes in the night with glowing eyes and too many teeth. I reckon this is where they'll find me when my time comes. Old shotgun in my hands, facing down those bloodshot eyes one last time. The hardest part isn't the fighting. It's not the long nights of watching and waiting, or even the moments of terror when you catch a glimpse of something moving wrong in the shadows. No, the hardest part is knowing that most people will never believe you, never understand what's really out there. I keep a journal now, recording everything I can about the creatures, their habits, their patterns, the ways they move and hunt. Sometimes I think I'm the only one left who remembers what really happened that night, what's still happening in the darker corners of our town. The tourist woman's name was Catherine Chen. She was 27, a software engineer from Seattle on vacation with friends. I looked her up afterward, needed to know who she was, make her more than just another victim. Her family still thinks she was killed by a bear. Sometimes I wonder if that's better, if knowing the truth would only make their loss harder to bear. Harris left me everything when he died. His apartment above the pharmacy, his weapons, his notes. Turns out he'd been keeping records for decades, tracking the creature's appearances back to the 1940s. The old mine features prominently in his research. Something was found down there, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. I've tried going into the mine, but the entrance collapsed years ago. Maybe that's for the best. Some doors are better left closed, some mysteries better left unsolved. But I can't help wondering what's down there. What kind of thin spot could let these things through into our world? The creatures are evolving, adapting. They're getting better at hiding, at blending in. Sometimes I catch glimpses of them trying to mimic human movement, walking upright instead of that spider-like scramble. It terrifies me more than their natural state, the idea that they might be learning, studying us. Last week I found tracks near the old Johnson place, not the usual kind. These looked almost human except for the spacing and depth. Something heavy walking on legs that were too long, trying to pass as normal. I set up cameras, but they never show anything. Either the creatures don't show up on film, or they're smart enough to avoid being recorded. The town's down to 1,200 people now. The ski resort closed last season. Couldn't keep enough staff. Too many disappearances, too many accidents that couldn't be explained away. The teenagers don't go to the quarry anymore. Seems they've developed better survival instincts than their parents. I patrol every night, walking the same routes Harris and I established years ago. The old pharmacist's rifle is retired now, hanging above my fireplace more as a memorial than a weapon. I use something with a bit more punch these days. You learn what works and what doesn't when you've been fighting monsters as long as I have. The creatures don't like silver, oddly enough. Not that it kills them. I'm not sure anything can truly kill them, but it seems to hurt them, drive them back. I keep silver bullets for emergencies when running isn't an option. They're expensive, hard to come by, but worth every penny when you're staring down one of those twisted faces. Sometimes I wonder if I should leave, find somewhere normal to spend whatever years I have left. But I can't. Whisper Falls is my home, my battlefield. I'm the last line of defense, the crazy old deputy who knows what's really out there in the dark. Besides, who would believe me? Who would take up the watch if I left? The world isn't ready to know about the things that slip through the thin spots, the creatures that hunger for more than just flesh. So I stay, and I watch, and I fight when I have to. Let them come. Let them try to drag us back into their darkness. They'll find we bite back harder. Because that's the thing about small towns. Sometimes we've got more stubbornness than sense, more fight than fear. And me? I'm just the guardian, the keeper of secrets too terrible for most folks to handle. The last defender of a town that's slowly being eaten away, not just by monsters, but by the weight of knowing last night. Something changed. I was doing my usual patrol, checking the perimeter near the old mine entrance, when I noticed the smell. That same sour meat stench from all those years ago, but stronger, more concentrated. The air felt wrong, heavy with static like before a thunderstorm. The collapse that sealed the mine wasn't natural. Harris and I made sure of that back in 15. Too many creatures coming up from those depths, too many close calls. We used enough explosives to bring down half the mountain, or so we thought. But as I stood there in the darkness, I could hear something shifting beneath the rubble. My flashlight beam caught movement in the shadows, not just one pair of those bloodshot eyes, but dozens. They were gathering, more than I'd ever seen in one place. The beam reflected off pale, twisted limbs and swollen heads, all of them swaying slightly like branches in a wind I couldn't feel. I did what Harris taught me, stood my ground, raised the silver-loaded shotgun and waited. The creatures watched me, their huge eyes unblinking. Then something else emerged from behind them, something bigger. Its head was massive, even by their standards, skin stretched tight over a skull that seemed to pulse with its own light. It spoke. Not in words, not exactly. The sound bypassed my ears and went straight to my brain, a series of images and feelings that made my nose bleed and my teeth ache. I saw the mine as it was before, saw what the miners found down there in the darkness, saw why the creatures kept coming back, why they needed to feed. They weren't just hunting, they were preparing. The thin spot Harris talked about? It wasn't just letting things through, it was getting bigger. Each person they took, each life they consumed, made the barrier between worlds just a little bit weaker. And now, after all these years, it was finally ready to tear completely. I understood then why Harris had been so adamant about teaching me everything he knew. He must have sensed this coming, known that eventually the creatures would make their final push, the wolf pack descending after years of picking off strays. I had a choice to make. Could have run, warned the town, tried to evacuate. But that would have just spread the problem, given the creatures more hunting ground. Instead, I thought about Catherine Chen, about the Johnsons, about every person these things had taken over the years. I reached into my jacket and pulled out Harris's last gift, a detonator he'd rigged up years ago, connected to charges we'd hidden throughout the old mine system. Insurance, he'd called it. The charges had been down there so long I wasn't even sure they'd still work. The creature leader must have sensed what I was planning. The whole pack surged forward, moving with that terrible spider-like grace. But I had the high ground and years of practice with this particular dance. The silver shots wouldn't kill them, but they bought me the seconds I needed. I wish I could say I had some profound last words, some perfect movie hero line. Truth is, I just smiled, thinking about Harris and his crazy theories that turned out to be right all along. Then I pressed the button. The explosion started deep, a rumble that built into a roar. The ground buckled and split, and then it got strange. The air itself seemed to tear, showing something beyond the flames and smoke, something I thank God I only glimpsed for a second. The creatures screamed, not their usual shrieks, but something deeper, more primal. Then the whole mountainside came down. I'm writing this from a hospital bed in Denver. They tell me I'm lucky to be alive, that most of the mountain collapsed into the old mine system. Official story is that the abandoned tunnels finally gave way, taking a chunk of Whisper Falls with them. 3 blocks of the old town are just gone, swallowed by the earth. They found me half a mile away, covered in dust and blood, still clutching Harris's old rifle. The doctors say I'm suffering from severe concussion and smoke inhalation. They whisper about PTSD and trauma when they think I can't hear them. But I know what I saw, know what really happened that night. The thin spot is gone now, sealed under thousands of tons of rock and whatever else came through in those final moments. The creatures that survived, and I'm sure some did, will have to find another way into our world. Sometimes at night I still hear that voice in my head, still see those impossible visions. But the dreams are getting fainter, the memories less sharp. Maybe that's for the best. They're rebuilding parts of Whisper Falls, talking about turning it into a proper ski resort town now that the unstable mine situation has been resolved. Young families are moving in, bringing new life to the old streets. Most of them don't know the history, don't recognize the names on the missing persons lists that go back decades. I've been thinking about staying, maybe opening a small security consulting business. Someone needs to keep an eye on things, watch for signs that they've found another way through. Harris would have wanted that, because that's the thing about monsters. They don't just give up. And that's the thing about small-town folks. We don't either. We guard our own, keep our secrets, and stand ready for whatever comes next. My name's Ben Walker. I used to be a deputy in Whisper Falls, Colorado. Now I'm something else, a watchman, a guardian, a keeper of darker truths. And if you're ever driving through our little town late at night, and you catch a whiff of something that smells like spoiled meat, or see something moving wrong in the shadows, well, you know who to call. Just don't expect anyone else to believe you. The frosty morning air nipped at my exposed skin as I stepped out onto the weathered porch of my grandparents' cabin. Dew still clung to the grass, sparkling like a sea of diamonds in the early morning light. I took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp, pine-scented air that was so different from the smog-filled atmosphere of my urban home. This secluded retreat in the heart of Idaho had always captured my imagination, its isolation both enticing and slightly unnerving. I had arrived at the cabin late the previous night, driving up from Boise after work. My grandparents had long since passed, but the family had kept the property, using it for the occasional getaway. It had been years since I'd visited, and as I stood there, taking in the breathtaking view of the dense forest that surrounded the clearing, I felt a mixture of nostalgia and anticipation. The cabin itself was a testament to my grandfather's craftsmanship. Built with his own hands in the 1960s, it stood as a two-story log structure, its wood darkened with age but still sturdy. A stone chimney climbed up one side, promising warmth on cold nights. The porch wrapped around three sides of the building, offering various vantage points to observe the wilderness. As I sipped my coffee, letting its warmth chase away the morning chill, I made a decision. Today I would explore the woods that had always beckoned to me as a child. Back then, my grandmother's stern warnings had kept me close to the cabin. "Those woods aren't safe for little ones," she'd say, her eyes darting nervously to the tree line. But I wasn't a child anymore, and the mystery of what lay beyond the clearing was too tempting to resist. I went back inside to prepare for my adventure. The interior of the cabin was cozy, filled with rustic furniture and family mementos. Faded photographs lined the walls, showcasing generations of smiling faces set against the backdrop of these very woods. As I gathered supplies, my eyes lingered on a particular image, my grandfather standing proudly next to a massive elk he'd hunted. There was something in his eyes, a wariness that seemed at odds with his triumphant pose. I shook off the unsettling feeling and focused on the task at hand. In the kitchen, I rummaged through the cabinets, packing a small backpack with water bottles, granola bars, and a first aid kit. I found an old flashlight in a drawer and tossed it in as well, though I didn't plan to be out after dark. As an afterthought, I grabbed a worn trail map from a stack of papers on the counter. It was yellowed with age, its creases deep and well worn, but it might prove useful if I strayed too far. Upstairs, I changed into what I hoped would be suitable attire for a forest trek. My usual city clothes, skinny jeans and a light sweater, were quickly swapped for a pair of cargo pants and a long-sleeved flannel shirt. I laced up the only boots I'd brought, a pair of fashionable leather ankle boots that I now realized were woefully inadequate for serious hiking. Still, they were better than sneakers, I reasoned. Back on the porch, I took one last look at the cabin. A part of me felt foolish for this sudden urge to play explorer. I was a web developer from the city, not some seasoned outdoorsman. What did I know about navigating wilderness? But another part of me, the part that had always longed for adventure, for something beyond the glow of computer screens and the hum of traffic urged me forward. With a deep breath, I stepped off the porch and made my way across the clearing. The grass was tall, reaching almost to my knees in some places, evidence of how long it had been since anyone had stayed here. As I approached the tree line, I felt a slight hesitation. The forest loomed before me, ancient and imposing. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy that dimmed the morning light. I paused at the edge of the woods, looking back at the cabin one last time. It suddenly seemed very far away, a tiny island of familiarity in a vast sea of unknown. For a moment I considered turning back, spending the day reading on the porch or tidying up the cabin. But the pull of the forest was stronger. With a small nod of determination, I stepped under the canopy of leaves and into the woods. The change was immediate and profound. The sounds of the clearing, birds chirping, wind rustling through the grass faded away, replaced by a deep primal silence. The air felt different too, cooler and heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Shafts of sunlight pierced through gaps in the canopy, creating islands of light in the dim forest. I began to walk, my boots crunching softly on the carpet of leaves and pine needles. There was no clear path, so I picked my way carefully between the trees, using the occasional break in the canopy to orient myself with the position of the sun. I had a vague plan to head east for a couple of hours before turning back, hoping to discover some of the forest's secrets along the way. As I walked, the forest slowly came alive around me. I spotted squirrels darting up tree trunks, their chattering breaking the silence. Once I froze in place as a doe and her fawn crossed my path, their large eyes regarding me warily before they bounded away into the underbrush. The deeper I went, the more I began to relax, feeling a connection to the nature around me that I had never experienced in the city. But as the morning wore on, a nagging sense of unease began to creep over me. The trees seemed to grow larger, their trunks wider and more gnarled. The undergrowth became denser, forcing me to push through bushes and step over fallen logs. More than once I stumbled over hidden roots, my fashionable boots proving their inadequacy with each misstep. By midday I had to admit that I was lost. The sun, now high overhead, was no longer a reliable guide, and the sameness of the forest had me turned around. I pulled out the old map, but it was of little use. The landmarks it showed were nowhere to be seen, and I had no idea where on the weathered paper I might be. As I stood there trying to decide what to do, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was distant but unmistakable, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air. I whirled around, trying to pinpoint its source, but the dense forest played tricks with the sound, making it seem to come from everywhere at once. My heart pounding, I picked a direction at random and began to walk faster, no longer caring about stealth or discovery. The only thought in my mind was to put as much distance between myself and whatever had made that sound as possible. As I hurried through the woods, I became acutely aware of how ill-prepared I was for this situation. My thin flannel offered little protection, and my backpack suddenly felt woefully inadequate. The sound came again, closer this time. I broke into a run, heedless of the branches that whipped at my face and the uneven ground beneath my feet. Panic clouded my judgment, and I no longer tried to keep track of my direction. All that mattered was escape. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I burst into a small clearing. Doubling over, hands on my knees, I gasped for breath. The woods around me were silent once more, but the silence now felt oppressive, laden with hidden threats. As my breathing slowed, I straightened up and took stock of my surroundings. The clearing was unremarkable, just a small break in the endless trees, but as I turned in a slow circle, something caught my eye. There, at the base of a massive oak tree, was a sight that turned my blood to ice. An old, rusted animal trap lay on the ground, its metal jaws open wide and ready to snap shut on any unsuspecting prey. But it wasn't the trap itself that horrified me. It was the fresh blood that coated its teeth and spattered the leaves around it. Whatever had been caught in its cruel embrace had not escaped unscathed. I approached cautiously, my morbid curiosity overriding my fear for a moment. The blood was still wet, glistening in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the leaves. Around the trap, I could see signs of a desperate struggle. The ground was torn up, leaves and twigs scattered in a chaotic pattern, but the most chilling detail was the set of footprints leading away from the trap. They started as clear, crimson impressions in the soft earth, then gradually faded to smears of rusty brown. Whatever had been caught, and it was far too large to have been any normal forest animal, had managed to free itself and limp away. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, that growl came again. This time it was close, so close that I could almost feel the vibration of it in my chest. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, I turned around. At the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows of the trees, stood a creature that defied description. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of bear and wolf. Matted fur, caked with blood, and some unidentifiable viscous substance covered its muscular frame. But it was the face that truly paralyzed me with terror. The creature's muzzle was elongated, filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth that glinted in the dim light. Its eyes were the worst part. They were jet black, seeming to absorb all light, but within their depths I saw a cruel intelligence that was all too human. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think. Then, with a roar that shook the very air, the creature charged. Instinct took over. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for direction or stealth. Behind me I could hear the monster giving chase, its heavy footfalls and snapping of branches spurring me to greater speed. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that desperate flight. But eventually I became aware that the sounds of pursuit had faded. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw only empty forest behind me. Still, I didn't stop. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of my situation set in. I was hopelessly lost in a forest that was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. Night was approaching. The light filtering through the canopy had taken on the golden hue of late afternoon, and somewhere out there, a monster straight out of nightmare was hunting me. I slowed to a walk, trying to catch my breath and think rationally. I needed to find my way back to the cabin before dark. But how? I had no idea which direction I had come from, and in my panic, I had left a trail that even I could follow. Broken branches, trampled underbrush, and even, I noticed with a sick feeling, smears of blood where thorns had scratched my arms and face. As I stood there trying to decide what to do, I became aware of a sound. At first I thought it was just the wind rustling through the leaves, but as I listened more closely I realized it was something else. Whispers, faint, barely audible, but definitely there. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a chorus of hushed voices carried on the chill air. "Don't stay too long," they seemed to say. "You know what happens when night falls." I shook my head, trying to clear it. The stress and fear must be getting to me, I thought. There couldn't really be voices in the wind, could there? But as I started walking again, picking a direction at random, the whispers continued. They grew louder, more insistent, a cacophony of warnings and pleas. "Turn back," they urged, "before it's too late." I tried to ignore them, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other. But with each step, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if the entire forest had come alive, every tree and bush concealing watchful eyes. The fading light played tricks on my vision, turning shadows into lurking figures that vanished when I turned to look directly at them. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I came across another clearing. This one was larger than the last, and at its center stood a circle of standing stones. They were ancient, covered in moss and lichen, their surfaces etched with symbols I didn't recognize. The sight stopped me in my tracks. I approached cautiously, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and desperation. Perhaps these stones were a landmark, something that could help me find my way back to civilization. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. At the base of each stone were shallow pits, filled with a dark, decaying organic matter. The stench that rose from them was overwhelming, a miasma of rot and decay that made my eyes water and my stomach churn. And protruding from this foul mulch were what looked horribly like human bones. I staggered back, my mind reeling. What was this place? What kind of nightmarish ritual had been performed here? And most terrifyingly, was it still in use? The whispers in the wind had risen to a fever pitch, no longer just warnings, but a cacophony of anguished cries and desperate pleas. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. It was as if the voices were inside my head, a maelstrom of terror and despair that threatened to overwhelm me. Suddenly, cutting through the whispers like a knife, came a scream. It was high-pitched, filled with a terror so profound that it chilled me to my very core. And it was close. Without thinking, I began to run again. The scream had broken whatever spell the stone circle had cast over me, and now my only thought was escape. I crashed through the underbrush, heedless of the branches that whipped at my face and the roots that threatened to trip me. The scream came again, closer this time. It was followed by a roar that I recognized, the same bestial sound I had heard earlier. The monster was on the hunt again, and this time it had found prey. I ran faster, my lungs burning and my legs feeling like lead. The forest around me was a blur, the fading light turning everything into indistinct shadows. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond putting as much distance between myself and those terrible sounds as possible. But in my panic, I made a crucial mistake. I wasn't watching where I was going, and suddenly the ground disappeared from beneath my feet. I had run right off the edge of a steep embankment. For a moment, I was airborne, and then I was tumbling down the slope, bouncing off rocks and roots, unable to stop my descent. I came to a bruising halt at the bottom, my body aching from a dozen new injuries. For a moment I lay there, dazed and gasping for breath. But then I heard it, the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. Slowly, painfully I raised my head. And there it was. The creature stood at the top of the embankment, its massive form silhouetted against the darkening sky. Its eyes gleamed in the twilight, fixed on me with predatory intensity. Slowly, deliberately, it began to make its way down the slope towards me. I tried to get up, to run, to do anything, but my battered body wouldn't respond. All I could do was watch in horror as the monster approached, its claws leaving deep gouges in the earth with each step. This was it, I thought. This was how I was going to die, alone in these godforsaken woods, torn apart by a creature that shouldn't exist. But just as the monster reached the bottom of the slope, just as I could smell its fetid breath and see the saliva dripping from its fangs, something happened. A piercing whistle cut through the air, followed by a blinding flash of light. The creature reared back, roaring in pain and anger. I blinked, trying to clear the spots from my vision. When I could see again, I was amazed to find an old man standing between me and the monster. He was tall and lean, with a wild mane of white hair and a beard that reached almost to his waist. In one hand he held a gnarled wooden staff, in the other a strange, glowing stone that pulsed with an otherworldly light. "Back, you foul beast!" the old man shouted, his voice surprisingly strong and clear. He raised the stone higher, and its light intensified, causing the creature to shrink back with a pained howl. I watched in astonishment as the monster retreated, slinking back up the embankment and disappearing into the gathering darkness of the forest. Only when it was gone did the old man turn to me, his piercing blue eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something that looked oddly like recognition. "You shouldn't be here, child," he said, extending a gnarled hand to help me up. "These woods are not safe for the uninitiated." I took his hand, wincing as I got to my feet. Every part of my body ached from the fall and the day's ordeal. Who are you?" I managed to ask. "What was that thing?" The old man sighed heavily, suddenly looking every bit his considerable age. "My name is Ezra," he said. "I'm the guardian of these woods. As for that creature, it's something that should not exist in this world. An abomination born of dark magic and darker desires." He looked at me closely, his brow furrowing. "You're one of Margaret's grandchildren, aren't you? I recognize the family resemblance." I nodded, shocked. "Yes, I'm staying at my grandparents' cabin. But how did you know my grandmother?" Ezra's expression turned grim. "Margaret and I, we shared a burden, a secret, one that I fear you've now stumbled into." He glanced around, his eyes scanning the deepening shadows. But this is not the place for such discussions. Night is falling, and there are worse things than that beast that roam these woods after dark. Come, we must get you to safety. Without waiting for a response, Ezra turned and began to walk swiftly through the forest. I hesitated for a moment, my mind reeling from everything that had happened. But the memory of the monster's glowing eyes and razor-sharp teeth was enough to spur me into action. I hurried after Ezra, trying to keep up with his surprisingly quick pace. As we walked, I peppered Ezra with questions about the creature, about my grandmother, about the whispers in the wind. But he remained frustratingly tight-lipped, offering only cryptic responses and warnings to stay quiet and vigilant. The forest around us seemed to come alive as night fell. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, unearthly howls, chittering laughs, and occasionally something that sounded disturbingly like human screams. More than once I caught glimpses of glowing eyes watching us from the underbrush, only to disappear when I tried to get a closer look. Finally, after what felt like hours of trekking through the increasingly sinister woods, we emerged into a small clearing. At its center stood a cottage that looked like it had grown out of the forest itself. Its walls were a patchwork of stone and living wood, with vines and moss covering much of its surface. A warm golden light spilled from its windows, offering a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. Ezra ushered me inside quickly, slamming the door behind us and securing it with a series of locks and mystical-looking symbols. Only then did he seem to relax slightly. The interior of the cottage was a cluttered marvel. Every surface was covered with books, strange artifacts, and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling, filling the air with a pungent, earthy scent. In one corner, a fire crackled merrily in a large stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the room. "Sit," Ezra commanded, gesturing to a worn armchair near the fire. As I sank gratefully into its cushions, he busied himself at a workbench, mixing various powders and liquids into a cup. When he was done, he handed the concoction to me. "Drink this. It will help with the pain and protect you from outside influences." I sniffed the liquid cautiously. It smelled like a mixture of mint, earth, and something metallic. Against my better judgment, I took a sip. To my surprise, it wasn't unpleasant. Cool and refreshing, with a slight tingling sensation as it went down. Almost immediately, I felt the aches in my body begin to subside. Ezra settled into a chair opposite me, his blue eyes studying me intently. "Now," he said, "I suppose you have questions." I nodded, not even sure where to begin. What was that thing in the forest, and how did you know my grandmother?" Ezra sighed, running a hand through his wild hair. "The creature you encountered is known as a Skinwalker. It's an ancient evil, a being of chaos and destruction that delights in causing pain and fear. As for your grandmother—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Margaret was more than just a simple cabin owner. She was a guardian like me, tasked with keeping the boundary between our world and others." "Others?" I asked, my mind struggling to process what I was hearing. "You mean there are more worlds than ours?" Ezra nodded gravely. "More than you could imagine, child. Some beautiful beyond description. Others, well, let's just say that the Skinwalker is one of the less horrifying things that can slip through when the boundaries weaken." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "Your grandparents' cabin sits on a convergence point, a place where the veil between worlds is thin. For generations, your family has acted as guardians, maintaining the wards that keep our reality safe. But in recent years, as the old knowledge was forgotten and the wards neglected, things have begun to slip through." I shook my head, overwhelmed. "But why didn't anyone tell me? Why keep this a secret?" "Would you have believed it?" Ezra asked, raising an eyebrow. "Most people prefer to live in ignorance of the true nature of reality. It's easier that way, safer in many respects. But now that you've seen the truth, you have a choice to make." "A choice?" I echoed, a sense of foreboding settling in my stomach. Ezra nodded solemnly. "You can choose to forget. I can provide you with a potion that will erase the memories of today, allow you to return to your normal life. Or," he paused, his eyes boring into mine, "or you can choose to embrace your heritage, to learn the ways of the guardians and take up the mantle that your grandmother left behind. I sat back, my mind reeling. The rational part of me wanted to laugh, to dismiss all of this as the ramblings of a madman. But I couldn't deny what I had seen in the forest, the monster, the whispers, the strange magic Ezra had used. It was all real, however impossible it might seem. If I choose to learn, I said slowly, what would that mean? What would I have to do? Ezra's expression softened slightly. It would mean dedicating yourself to a life of service and secrecy, learning ancient magics, facing dangers that most people can't even imagine. It's not an easy path, but it's a necessary one. Without guardians like us, the barriers between worlds would crumble, and unimaginable horrors would be unleashed upon the earth. He stood up, walking to a cluttered bookshelf and pulling down an ancient leather-bound tome. "This was your grandmother's," he said, holding it out to me. "Her grimoire, a record of her knowledge and experiences as a guardian. If you choose this path, it will be your guide." I took the book with trembling hands. It felt heavy, both physically and with the weight of responsibility it represented. As I opened it, a slip of paper fell out, a photograph. I recognized it immediately as the one I had seen in the cabin, of my grandfather with his hunting trophy. But now, looking closer, I could see details I had missed before. The elk wasn't an elk at all, but something far more monstrous. And the look in my grandfather's eyes wasn't wariness, but a bone-deep weariness that I now understood all too well. I looked up at Ezra, 1,000 questions on my lips, but before I could speak, a bone-chilling howl split the night air. Ezra's head snapped towards the window, his expression grim. "It's found us," he said, grabbing his staff. "The Skinwalker, it must have followed our trail." Another howl, closer this time. The windows of the cottage rattled, and I could hear something large moving in the underbrush outside. Ezra turned to me, his eyes blazing with an inner fire. "I'm sorry, but your choice will have to wait. Right now we need to fight. Are you with me?" I looked down at the grimoire in my hands, then back up at Ezra. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to run, to hide, to wake up from this nightmare. But another part, a part I hadn't known existed until today, was stirring to life. I thought of my grandparents, of the secret burden they had carried all these years. I thought of the monster in the woods and all the other horrors that might be waiting to break through into our world. I stood up, my decision made. "I'm with you," I said, surprised at the steadiness in my voice. "Tell me what to do." Ezra nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. He handed me the glowing stone he had used earlier. "This is a moonstone," he explained quickly. "It channels lunar energy, which creatures like the Skinwalker can't stand. Focus your will through it, and it will protect you." He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "Remember," he said, looking back at me, "the Skinwalker is powerful, but it's not invincible. It fears the light, fears those who stand against it with true courage. Whatever happens, don't let your fear control you. That's what it wants." I nodded, gripping the moonstone tightly. Its cool surface pulsed with energy, almost like a heartbeat. "Ready?" Ezra asked. I took a deep breath, thinking of all that had led me to this moment. The woods that had always called to me, the secrets my family had kept, the horrors and wonders I had glimpsed today. Whatever happened next, I knew my life would never be the same. "Ready," I replied. Ezra threw open the door and we stepped out into the night, ready to face whatever horrors awaited us in the darkness of the forest. As we emerged from the cottage, the full moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting an eerie silver light over the clearing. The air was thick with tension, alive with the chittering and rustling of unseen creatures lurking just beyond the edge of visibility. Ezra raised his staff, muttering words in a language I didn't recognize. The tip began to glow with a soft, warm light that pushed back the encroaching shadows. I focused on the moonstone in my hand, willing it to shine brighter. To my amazement, it responded, its glow intensifying until it rivaled Ezra's staff. For a moment, all was still. Then, with a roar that shook the very ground, the Skinwalker burst from the tree line. It was even more terrifying than I remembered, its fur matted with blood and ichor, its eyes blazing with inhuman hunger and rage. "Stand your ground," Ezra shouted as the beast charged towards us. "Focus on the light. Don't let your fear control you." I wanted to run, Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to flee, but I remembered Ezra's words about courage, about the power of standing against the darkness. I planted my feet firmly, raised the moonstone high, and focused all my will on pushing back the encroaching horror. The Skinwalker faltered as it entered the circle of light created by Ezra's staff and my moonstone. It snarled in pain and fury, circling us warily. I could see its form shifting and warping, as if it couldn't decide on a single shape. One moment it was bear-like, the next more lupine, then something altogether alien and indescribable. "It's weakening," Ezra called out. "Keep focusing, we can drive it back." But even as he spoke, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. More shapes were emerging from the forest-twisted, nightmarish forms that defied description. The Skinwalker hadn't come alone. "Ezra," I cried out in warning, "there are more of them." The old guardian's face set in grim determination. "The barrier between worlds is weaker than I feared," he said. "We need to close it, or more will keep coming through." He began to chant, his voice rising and falling in a complex rhythm. The air around us seemed to thicken, charged with an electric energy that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The monsters pressed closer, held at bay only by our dwindling circle of light. "The grimoire," Ezra shouted between verses of his chant. "Your grandmother's grimoire. There's a sealing spell. Find it." With shaking hands, I pulled out the ancient book, flipping through its pages desperately. Strange symbols and arcane diagrams flashed before my eyes, incomprehensible yet somehow familiar. Finally, I found a page titled "The Great Seal" in my grandmother's neat handwriting. "I found it," I called out. "What do I do?" "Read it," Ezra replied, his voice strained as he continued his own incantation. "Put everything you have into the words. Believe in them. Make them real." I began to read, my voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each word. The language was strange, ancient, but it felt right on my tongue, as if I had always known how to speak it. As I read, I felt a power building within me, a connection to something vast and incomprehensible. The monsters howled and raged, pressing against our failing light. The Skinwalker lunged forward, its claws raking the air mere inches from my face. But I didn't falter, didn't stop reading. I poured everything I had into the words, my fear, my determination, my newfound sense of purpose. As I spoke the final word of the incantation, there was a moment of perfect stillness. Then, with a sound like reality itself tearing, a blinding light erupted from the ground beneath our feet. It shot upwards in a column of pure energy, piercing the night sky. The monsters screamed, not in rage now, but in terror and pain. I watched in awe as they were pulled towards the light, their bodies twisting and dissolving as they were drawn in. The Skinwalker fought the hardest, its claws leaving deep gouges in the earth as it struggled against the inexorable pull. But in the end, even it couldn't resist. With a final defiant roar, it too was sucked into the pillar of light. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. The clearing was plunged into darkness, lit only by the soft glow of the moon and stars above. I stood there, panting, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Slowly I became aware of Ezra's hand on my shoulder. "Well done, child," he said softly. "Well done indeed. You've closed the breach, at least for now. The barrier between worlds is restored." I looked at him, seeing the weariness etched deep in his face. "Is it over?" I asked. Ezra shook his head slowly. "No, not over. Never over. The battle between light and dark, between order and chaos, it's eternal. But for now, at least, we've won a reprieve." He gestured around the clearing. "Look closely. What do you see?" I blinked, looking around. At first, I saw nothing but shadows and moonlight. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I began to notice things. Shimmering lines of energy crisscrossing the ground. Strange, half-seen shapes flitting at the edge of vision. The forest suddenly seemed alive in a way I had never noticed before, pulsing with a hidden energy. "The veil between worlds," Ezra explained. "Now that you've used your power, you'll always be able to see it, to see the truth of reality that most people never notice." I nodded slowly, a mixture of awe and trepidation filling me. "So what happens now?" I asked. Ezra smiled, a mix of pride and sadness in his eyes. "Now, my dear, you have a choice to make. A real choice, not the rushed decision we faced earlier. You've seen the truth of our world, felt the power within you. You can choose to embrace this path, to become a guardian like your grandmother before you, or you can choose to forget, to return to the life you knew before. I looked down at the grimoire in my hands, feeling the weight of generations of knowledge and responsibility. Then I gazed out at the forest, seeing it with new eyes, the shimmering energies, the hidden realms just beyond normal perception. I thought of the terror I'd faced, but also of the exhilaration of standing against the darkness. If I choose to become a guardian, I said slowly, what would that mean? What would my life be like? Ezra sighed, leaning heavily on his staff. It would not be an easy life. You would need to learn the old ways, master ancient magics, and stand vigilant against threats most people can't even imagine. You would have to keep secrets from those you love, always living with one foot in this world and one in the hidden realms. He paused, his gaze distant. But it is also a life of purpose, of meaning beyond what most ever know. You would be part of something greater than yourself, a defender of reality itself, and you would see wonders beyond imagination, experience the true depth and breadth of existence. I nodded, considering his words carefully. And if I choose to forget, then I will brew a potion that will erase the memories of these events, Ezra replied. You'll return to your life in the city, remembering this only as a strange dream. The cabin and these woods will hold no more mystery for you than any other place. I closed my eyes, weighing the options. The rational part of me longed for the simplicity of my old life, my job, my friends, the comfortable routines I'd built. But another part, a part that had awakened in these woods, rebelled against the idea of forgetting, of turning away from the truth I'd discovered. I opened my eyes, my decision made. I choose to remember, I said, my voice steady. I choose to become a guardian. Ezra's face broke into a wide smile, years seeming to fall away from him. I had hoped you would say that, he said. Your grandmother would be proud. He straightened up, suddenly all business. We have much work to do then. The breach may be sealed for now, but there are always other weak points, other dangers, and you have much to learn. As if on cue, a cool breeze swept through the clearing, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers, not menacing now, but welcoming, approving. I felt a connection to the forest, to the hidden worlds beyond, that I knew would only grow stronger with time. Where do we start? I asked, eager to begin my new journey. Ezra gestured towards the cottage. First, rest. You've been through much today, and the path ahead is long. Tomorrow we'll begin your training in earnest. As we walked back to the cottage, I glanced over my shoulder at the moonlit clearing. For a moment I thought I saw a shimmering figure, a woman with kind eyes and a familiar smile. My grandmother. She nodded once, then faded away like mist in the morning sun. I smiled, feeling a sense of continuity, of belonging to something greater than myself. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I was where I was meant to be. Inside the cottage, as Ezra busied himself brewing tea and gathering books for my upcoming lessons, I settled into the worn armchair by the fire. I opened my grandmother's grimoire, running my fingers over the pages filled with her neat handwriting and intricate diagrams. On the inside cover, I noticed an inscription I hadn't seen before. To those who guard the boundaries between worlds, who stand against the darkness with light in their hearts, remember always. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The greatest magic lies within you. I smiled, tracing the words with my finger. As the fire crackled and Ezra hummed an ancient tune while he worked, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. The world outside might be full of dangers and dark magic, but in this moment, in this place, I was exactly where I needed to be. My journey as a guardian was just beginning, and though I knew it would be filled with challenges and terrors I could scarcely imagine, I also knew I was ready to face them. With the wisdom of those who came before me, the guidance of Ezra, and the power I was only beginning to understand within myself, I would learn to navigate the hidden realms and protect the boundaries between worlds. As I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the gentle scratching of Ezra's quill and the soft glow of the moonstone on the table beside me, I dreamed of forests filled with wonders, of battles against shadow, and of a legacy stretching back through time immemorial. In the morning, my new life would begin in earnest. But for now, I rested, safe in the knowledge that I had found my true calling. The whispers in the woods had led me home,